There was a war that never fired a shot, yet haunted the dreams of billions. A conflict fought not on battlefields, but in shadows, in silence, in the space between breath and fear. For nearly half a century, two giants stood across from one another, each holding the power to end the world, each waiting for the other to blink. This was the Cold War, not a war of fire, but of ice. Not a war of soldiers, but of souls. And tonight, as the world quiets and the stars remember what we've forgotten, we return to those years when humanity stood at the edge of its own ending and somehow, softly, chose to step back. Close your eyes. Let the past wash over you like a distant tide. And together, we'll walk through the long, cold night that shaped the world you woke up in today. Before we begin this journey through time, if these words feel like a companion in the quiet hours, if this voice becomes part of your evening ritual, consider letting it stay. Subscribe so that each night, history can find you here, in this gentle space between waking and dreaming. No pressure. No urgency, only an invitation to let stories like these be part of your rest. Now, let's continue softly together. Chapter 1. The world breaks in two. The war was over, but the world was not at peace. In the spring of 1945, as the last guns fell silent across Europe and the Pacific, millions stood among the ruins and tried to remember what normal felt like. Cities that had once hummed with life now lay broken, their streets lined with rubble and memory. Fathers who had left as young men returned as ghosts in uniform, their eyes carrying things no parade could erase. Children played in bombed-out buildings, making games of the debris, not yet understanding that they were dancing on graves. The air itself seemed different, heavier, as though the earth was still processing the weight of what had been done to it. This was supposed to be the dawn of lasting peace, the moment when humanity learned its lesson and chose a different path. But in the quiet spaces between celebration and mourning, something else was taking shape. A fracture, thin as a whisper at first, beginning to split the world in two. The alliance that had defeated fascism was never built to last. It was a marriage of necessity, a temporary union against a common enemy, and with that enemy now gone, the partners looked at each other across the table and realized they had nothing left in common but suspicion. On one side stood the United States, emerging from the war wealthier and more powerful than ever, its cities untouched by bombs, its factories humming, its vision of the future bright with capitalism and democracy, and the promise that freedom and prosperity were the same thing. On the other side stood the Soviet Union, bloodied and victorious, having lost more than 20 million souls to push the Nazi war machine back from Stalingrad to Berlin. Its leader, Joseph Stalin, cold and calculating, its vision of the future rooted in communism, in the belief that only through collective ownership and centralized control could true equality be achieved. These were not just different political systems. They were different religions, different dreams of what humanity could become, and neither side believed there was room in the world for both. The meetings began even before the war ended. Yalta, in February 1945, where Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin sat together and carved up Europe like a meal. The photographs from that conference show three men smiling, shaking hands, projecting unity, but the words they spoke in private told a different story. Stalin wanted security, a buffer of loyal nations between the Soviet Union and the West, insurance that never again would foreign armies march into Russian soil. Roosevelt and Churchill wanted democracy, free elections, self-determination for the nations that had suffered under Nazi occupation. They spoke past each other, each hearing what they wanted to hear, each leaving Yalta believing they had won concessions that would never be honored. Then Roosevelt died and Truman took his place, and the tone shifted from cautious cooperation to something harder, colder. By the time they met again at Potsdam in July, the smiles were gone. Stalin spoke of spheres of influence. Truman spoke of atomic bombs. And the world, exhausted and broken, watched as the victors began to circle each other like wolves. Europe became the battlefield, not of guns, but of influence. In Poland, in Hungary, in Romania and Bulgaria, Soviet forces remained after liberation, and liberation quietly became occupation. Elections were held, but the outcomes were predetermined, the results announced before the votes were counted. Non-communist politicians disappeared in the night, returning weeks later broken or not returning at all. Newspapers that criticized the new governments were shut down. Borders closed. Stalin installed puppet regimes loyal to Moscow, leaders who understood that their power depended entirely on Soviet tanks remaining in their capitals. Churchill watched this unfold with growing alarm, and in March 1946, in a speech delivered in Fulton, Missouri, with President Truman sitting behind him on the stage, he spoke the words that would define the era. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, Churchill said, his voice heavy with warning, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. The phrase was poetic, apocalyptic, perfect. The Iron Curtain, an invisible wall dividing East from West, freedom from tyranny, hope from fear. And though it was only a metaphor then, it would soon become terrifyingly real. The United States could not ignore what was happening. Not after spending blood and treasure to liberate Europe, not after promising a world made safe for democracy. In 1947, President Truman stood before Congress and delivered a doctrine that would guide American foreign policy for decades. The choice facing the world, he said, was not between competing economic systems, but between two ways of life, one based on freedom, the other on oppression. And the United States, he declared, would support free peoples everywhere, resisting subjugation by armed minorities or outside pressures. It sounded noble, almost selfless, a beacon of hope in dark times. But it was also a declaration of ideological war, a promise to oppose Soviet expansion wherever it appeared, to contain communism like a disease before it spread. The Truman Doctrine was followed quickly by the Marshall Plan. Billions of dollars poured into rebuilding Western Europe, repairing factories and roads and economies, not just out of generosity, but out of calculation. Prosperous nations were less likely to turn to communism, less likely to invite Soviet influence. Stalin saw the Marshall Plan for what it was, an attempt to buy loyalty, and he forbade Eastern European nations under his control from accepting American aid. The division deepened. The fracture widened. And the world, which had hoped for unity, found itself sorting into camps. Nowhere was this division more visible, more painful than in Germany. The nation that had started the war now became its final prize, divided into 4 occupation zones controlled by the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. Berlin, the capital, sat deep inside the Soviet zone but was itself divided into 4 sectors, a city split among the victors. At first, the division was administrative, temporary, a practical solution until Germany could be reunified. But as East and West grew more hostile, Berlin became a symbol, a test of wills. The Western sectors began to merge, their economies integrated, their currency reformed, their future imagined as part of a democratic West Germany. Stalin saw this as a violation of the agreements made at Yalta and Potsdam, an attempt to resurrect German power on his doorstep. And so, in June 1948, he made his move. Soviet forces blockaded West Berlin, cutting off all road, rail, and canal access, choking the city, starving it, betting that the Western powers would either abandon their sectors or risk war to supply them. It was a gamble, a chess move designed to force a surrender without firing a shot. But the West did not abandon Berlin. Instead, they did something unexpected, something that required faith and endurance and a willingness to sustain the impossible. They began to fly. The Berlin airlift, as it came to be known, was a logistical miracle born of desperation. American and British cargo planes, hundreds of them, began landing in West Berlin every few minutes, around the clock, bringing food, coal, medicine, everything a city of 2 million people needed to survive. Pilots flew in fog and snow and darkness, navigating narrow air corridors, landing on runways that barely had time to cool between flights. They brought flour and powdered milk for children, coal to heat homes through the winter, hope delivered in crates and sacks. The people of West Berlin watched the skies and called them Rosenenbomber, raisin bombers, because the pilots would sometimes drop candy attached to tiny parachutes for the children waiting below. It was an act of defiance wrapped in kindness, a refusal to let an entire city be held hostage, and it worked. For 11 months, the airlift continued, delivering more than 2 million tons of supplies, proving that Berlin could be sustained indefinitely from the air. Stalin finally lifted the blockade in May 1949, admitting defeat without ever calling it that, but the damage was done. The blockade had made the division of Germany permanent in all but name. West Germany would become a nation aligned with the West-East Germany, a Soviet satellite. And Berlin, that wounded city, would remain split, a symbol of everything the Cold War would become. The formation of military alliances followed inevitably, like the next move in a game both sides knew they were playing. In April 1949, 12 nations signed the North Atlantic Treaty in Washington, creating NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It was a collective defense pact, an agreement that an attack on one member would be considered an attack on all, a promise that Western Europe would not stand alone if Soviet tanks ever rolled westward. The treaty was defensive in language but offensive in implication, a line drawn across the map that said this far and no further. Stalin watched NATO's creation with fury and fear, seeing it as confirmation of what he had always suspected, that the West was encircling the Soviet Union, preparing for the next war, building alliances designed to crush communism. He responded in kind. In 1955, after West Germany was admitted to NATO, the Soviet Union formed the Warsaw Pact, binding together the Eastern European nations already under its control into a formal military alliance. Now both sides had their armies, their treaties, their promises to defend and retaliate. The world was no longer divided by ideology alone, but by steel and strategy, by battalions positioned along borders, by the understanding that any conflict between East and West would not be small or local but total and catastrophic. And beneath it all, beneath the treaties and the speeches and the posturing, was fear. Not the sharp, sudden fear of bombs falling, but the slow, corrosive fear of not knowing what would come next, of living in a world where the rules had changed and no one could agree on what the new rules were. In America, the fear took the form of paranoia, a conviction that communists were everywhere, hidden among neighbors and colleagues, working to undermine the nation from within. Senator Joseph McCarthy rose to prominence by claiming to have lists of communists working in the State Department, in Hollywood, in the military. He never produced the lists, never proved his accusations, but the accusations themselves were enough. Careers were destroyed on suspicion alone. Artists, writers, teachers, actors found themselves blacklisted, unemployable, their loyalty questioned because of books they had read or meetings they had attended years before. The House Un-American Activities Committee held hearings that felt more like inquisitions, demanding that witnesses name names, confess associations, prove their patriotism by betraying friends. It was a witch hunt disguised as vigilance, and it spread like a sickness, turning neighbor against neighbor, replacing trust with suspicion. People stopped saying certain things, stopped attending certain gatherings, stopped reading certain books, not because they believed differently, but because they were afraid of being seen, of being reported, of being the next name called before the committee. In the Soviet Union, the fear was different but no less suffocating. Stalin's paranoia had always been vast, but in the years after the war, it grew into something monstrous. He saw enemies everywhere, in the military, in the party, among the intelligentsia, even among those who had fought most loyally for the Soviet cause. The purges that had terrorized the country in the 1930s resumed, quieter this time but no less deadly. Officers who had liberated Eastern Europe were arrested and executed, accused of being Western spies. Jewish doctors were rounded up and charged with plotting to poison Soviet leaders, a fabrication so absurd it revealed the depth of Stalin's delusions. Artists and writers who depicted Soviet life with anything less than total adoration were silenced, sent to gulags in Siberia, where the cold and labor killed slowly. The message was clear. Safety lay only in absolute obedience, in never questioning, never doubting, never allowing even a flicker of independent thought to show on your face. Millions lived in a state of perpetual caution, understanding that survival meant invisibility, that the best way to avoid the knock on the door in the middle of the night was to never stand out, never be noticed, never matter enough to become a target. The world that emerged from the wreckage of World War II was not the world anyone had hoped for. It was a world of walls and curtains, of alliances and suspicions, of two superpowers glaring at each other across an ideological chasm and convincing their citizens that the other side represented existential evil. In the West, children were taught that communism meant slavery, the end of freedom, a system where the state controlled everything and individuality died. In the East, children were taught that capitalism meant exploitation, where the rich devoured the poor and wars were fought for profit. Both sides believed they were telling the truth. Both sides believed they were defending something sacred. And perhaps that was the most dangerous thing of all, that this was not a conflict of cynics, but of true believers, people who were willing to risk everything, including the survival of the species, because they could not imagine a world where the other side prevailed. By the end of the 1940s, the Cold War was no longer a possibility or a metaphor. It was the defining reality of international life, the lens through which every crisis would be interpreted, every conflict understood. The world had broken in two, not along geographic lines but along lines of belief, and that break would shape everything that followed: the wars, the technologies, the art, the fear, the dreams, the way children learn to see the future. This was the inheritance of victory, the prize for defeating fascism. Not peace, but a different kind of war. Not unity, but permanent division. And as the 1950s began, as both sides dug in and prepared for a struggle they knew would last generations, the only certainty was that no one knew how this story would end, or if humanity would survive long enough to see its conclusion. Chapter 2: The Atomic Shadow. August 29, 1949. In the remote deserts of Kazakhstan, far from any city, far from witnesses, the Soviet Union detonated its first atomic bomb. The flash lit up the morning sky like a second sun, and the shockwave rippled outward, flattening buildings constructed specifically to measure the blast, vaporizing equipment, turning sand to glass. Soviet scientists watched from a safe distance, their instruments recording data, their faces betraying nothing, though inside many of them felt a mixture of pride and horror at what they had achieved. They called it First Lightning. The test was kept secret for weeks, but American surveillance detected the radioactive traces in the atmosphere, and suddenly the unthinkable had happened. The atomic monopoly, which American strategists had believed would last a decade or more, had lasted only 4 years. The Soviets had the bomb. The age of singular nuclear power was over, replaced by something far more terrifying: the balance of terror, where two nations possessed the ability to annihilate each other, and the only thing preventing it was the hope that mutual destruction would be deterrent enough. President Truman announced the Soviet test to the American public in September, his words carefully chosen to avoid panic, but panic came anyway. The newspapers ran diagrams showing blast radiuses, calculating how many millions would die if a bomb fell on New York or Chicago or Los Angeles. Civil defense agencies sprang into action, distributing pamphlets with instructions that seemed both urgent and absurd: how to build a fallout shelter in your basement, how to stockpile canned goods and water, how to shield yourself from radiation with sandbags and sheets of lead. Schools began conducting air raid drills, teaching children to duck and cover under their desks, as though wood and formica could protect them from weapons that turned cities into hash. The drills became routine, a strange new ritual woven into everyday life. A siren would sound, and students would file calmly into hallways, sit with their backs against the walls, tuck their heads between their knees, and wait. Teachers reassured them this was just practice, just preparation. But the children understood on some level that if the sirens ever sounded for real, if the flash came, ducking under a desk would not save them. Still, they practiced, because practicing gave the illusion of control, the comforting lie that survival was possible if you just followed the instructions. The arms race that followed was unlike anything humanity had ever attempted. Both nations poured resources into building more bombs, better bombs, delivery systems that could carry warheads farther and faster. Factories that had built tanks and planes during World War II now produced missiles and nuclear cores. Scientists who had hoped to return to pure research found themselves conscripted into weapons programs, their brilliance bent toward the mathematics of destruction. The bombs grew larger, more powerful, each generation eclipsing the last. The weapons that destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki, terrible as they were crude by comparison to what came next. Fission gave way to fusion, atomic bombs to hydrogen bombs, devices so powerful that they measured their yield not in thousands of tons of TNT, but in millions megatons. A single hydrogen bomb could level an entire city, could ignite firestorms that consumed everything for miles, could release radiation that would poison the land for generations. And both sides built them by the hundreds, then by the thousands, stockpiling enough destructive power to obliterate human civilization several times over, as though once was not sufficient. In November 1952, the United States detonated the first hydrogen bomb on a small island in the Pacific. The explosion was so immense it erased the island entirely, leaving only a crater in the ocean floor. The mushroom cloud rose 60 miles into the atmosphere, its heat so intense that observers 50 miles away felt their skin burn. The Soviet Union responded with its own hydrogen bomb test in 1953. Then the United States built a bigger one. Then the Soviets built one bigger still. An escalation with no logical endpoint, a competition where winning meant possessing the capacity to destroy the world more thoroughly than your opponent. Military planners spoke in acronyms and euphemisms and ad for mutually assured destruction. First strike capability, second strike capability, acceptable losses. They ran simulations, calculated scenarios, mapped out strategies for nuclear war as though it were something that could be managed, controlled, won. But the numbers told a different story. The numbers said that any nuclear exchange between the superpowers would kill hundreds of millions immediately and condemn countless more to slow death from radiation and starvation and the collapse of every system that sustained modern life. The numbers said there were no winners, only degrees of extinction, and yet life continued. People went to work, fell in love, raised children, made plans for the future, all while living under the knowledge that the future could end at any moment. It was a strange kind of cognitive dissonance, a split in the collective mind where one part acknowledged the danger and another part refused to dwell on it because dwelling on it would make ordinary life impossible. Families gathered around dinner tables and talked about school and promotions and weekend plans, the television playing in the background, the news occasionally interrupting with updates about missile tests or diplomatic tensions, and then returning to sitcoms and variety shows, the sacred and the mundane existing side by side. In backyards across America, fathers dug fallout shelters, concrete boxes buried underground, stocked with canned food and bottled water and medical supplies and board games to pass the time while the radiation decayed outside. Some shelters were elaborate, with ventilation systems and generators, entire subterranean apartments designed to sustain a family for weeks. Others were little more than holes covered with plywood and dirt, symbols of preparedness that offered more psychological comfort than actual protection. Real estate agents began advertising homes with fallout shelters as a selling point, a feature listed alongside the number of bedrooms and the size of the garage, as though survival from nuclear war was just another modern convenience. The government contributed to this strange theater of preparedness, with films and propaganda that tried to make the unthinkable seem manageable. Civil defense films showed families calmly entering their shelters, sealing the door, sitting together under the glow of lanterns, waiting out the attack as though it were a particularly severe storm. The films never showed what came after. The weeks of isolation, the uncertainty of when it was safe to emerge, the world that would greet them if they did. The cities gone, the infrastructure collapsed, the hospitals overwhelmed, the food supply contaminated, the government itself possibly obliterated. Instead, the films focused on preparation, on the small actions individuals could take, reinforcing the idea that survival was a matter of personal responsibility, that if you died in a nuclear war, it was because you had not prepared adequately, not because your government had built weapons capable of ending the world and then threatened to use them. The Soviet Union had its own version of this theater, though it was quieter, less visible to the outside world. Soviet citizens were not encouraged to build private shelters. Such individualism ran counter to the collective ethos, but they were shown government bunkers, massive underground complexes designed to preserve the party leadership and essential personnel in the event of war. Metro stations in Moscow were built deep, reinforced with concrete thick enough to withstand a nuclear blast, serving dual purposes as transportation hubs and public shelters. Citizens were told that in the event of an attack, they should proceed calmly to the nearest station, that the state would protect them, that Soviet engineering had anticipated every contingency. But the truth, which everyone understood but no one spoke aloud, was that there was not enough shelter space for everyone. That protection was a privilege reserved for the important, and that ordinary people would face the bombs with nothing but hope and whatever walls they happened to be standing behind when the sirens sounded. The Soviet government distributed gas masks and held civil defense exercises, entire cities practicing evacuations, but the exercises felt more like rituals than preparations, performances of readiness designed to reassure the population that someone was in control, that the state had a plan, even if that plan was fundamentally inadequate to the scale of the threat. The scientists who created these weapons lived with a unique burden. Many of them had entered weapons research out of patriotism, believing they were defending their nations, preventing war through strength, ensuring that the other side would never dare to strike first. But as the arsenals grew, as the destructive capacity multiplied beyond any conceivable military purpose, some began to question what they had built. J. Robert Oppenheimer, who had led the Manhattan Project and watched the first atomic bomb test in the New Mexico desert, later said that he had become death, the destroyer of worlds, quoting ancient scripture, because modern language had no words adequate to the magnitude of what had been unleashed. He opposed the development of the hydrogen bomb, arguing that it was a weapon of genocide with no legitimate military application. And for his opposition, he was stripped of his security clearance, ostracized, punished for developing a conscience about the weapons he had helped create. In the Soviet Union, Andrei Sakharov, the brilliant physicist who designed the Soviet hydrogen bomb, would eventually become a dissident, speaking out against nuclear testing and totalitarianism, his moral awakening coming slowly, painfully, as he realized that the weapons he had built were not just tools of defense, but instruments of potential apocalypse that served no one's true interests, not even the states that possessed them. The testing of these weapons became its own form of violence, a rehearsal for apocalypse conducted in remote locations where the harm seemed distant, abstract. The United States tested bombs in the Nevada desert and on Pacific Islands, the Soviet Union in Kazakhstan, and in the Arctic. Each test released radioactive fallout into the atmosphere, particles that drifted on wind currents, settled on farmland, contaminated water supplies, entered the food chain. Scientists tracked the spread of strontium-90 and cesium-137, isotopes that accumulated in bones and tissues that caused cancers and birth defects and genetic damage that would not manifest for years, for generations. Downwind communities, the people who lived near test sites, began to notice patterns, clusters of leukemia, thyroid cancers appearing in children, livestock dying mysteriously, illnesses that doctors could not explain, but that correlated unmistakably with the timing of the tests. The governments conducting the tests assured the public that everything was safe, that the radiation levels were minimal, that any health effects were coincidental, but the assurances rang hollow as the bodies piled up, as more and more families found themselves mourning losses that should never have happened, casualties of a war that had not even been fought yet. In the Marshall Islands, where the United States conducted some of its most powerful tests, entire communities were displaced, removed from islands that had been their homes for generations, relocated to places where the soil was different, the fishing grounds unfamiliar, the land unsuited to their way of life. Some were allowed to return years later, only to discover that the islands were still contaminated, that the coconuts and fish were radioactive, that the paradise they remembered was now a poisoned place where nothing could grow safely, where children born after the return carried genetic mutations that testified to the lingering presence of invisible poison. The Soviet Union was no better, conducting tests that exposed military personnel to radiation deliberately, studying the effects, treating soldiers as experimental subjects, documenting how long they could function in radioactive environments, what doses were lethal, what doses merely caused suffering. These were crimes committed in the name of science and security, atrocities justified by the logic of the Cold War, the idea that any sacrifice was acceptable if it contributed to the greater goal of victory or survival, or maintaining the balance of terror that kept the missiles in their silos. The delivery systems evolved as quickly as the weapons themselves. At first, atomic bombs were so large and heavy they could only be carried by long-range bombers. Massive aircraft like the B-29 Superfortress or the later B-52 Stratofortress, planes that flew for hours to reach their targets, vulnerable to enemy fighters and anti-aircraft fire, their missions dangerous but at least comprehensible in traditional military terms. But bombers were slow, and slow meant the enemy had time to respond, to launch their own bombers, to turn any nuclear exchange into a race where both sides might be destroyed before either achieved their objectives. The solution was missiles, intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, that could arc through space and deliver their warheads to targets thousands of miles away in less than 30 minutes. The Soviet Union achieved this capability first, launching Sputnik in 1957, a small satellite that beeped its way across the sky and proved that Soviet rockets could reach orbit, which meant they could reach any point on Earth. America panicked, the Sputnik crisis sparking fears of a missile gap, a belief that the Soviets had surged ahead in the arms race, that American cities were now vulnerable to attack without warning. Congress poured money into missile development, into the space program, into education in science and mathematics, desperate to close the gap, to restore the sense of security that had been shattered by that beeping satellite passing overhead. Submarines entered the equation, adding another dimension to the nightmare. Nuclear-powered submarines that could stay submerged for months, prowling the depths of the ocean, carrying ballistic missiles in vertical launch tubes, invisible to satellites and radar, capable of surfacing anywhere and launching a strike without warning. These submarines became the ultimate insurance policy, the guarantee of second strike capability, the promise that even if your entire country was destroyed in a surprise attack, your submarines would survive, hidden beneath the waves, and would retaliate, ensuring that the aggressor paid the ultimate price for their aggression. It was deterrence through guaranteed revenge. The logic of mutual assured destruction made portable and invisible, and it worked, in the sense that no one ever launched a first strike, but it also meant that the threat was everywhere, that there was no safe distance, no place on Earth beyond the reach of annihilation, no moment when anyone could truly relax because somewhere, always, submarines were gliding through dark water with their fingers on the triggers of apocalypse. By the end of the 1950s, the world had learned to live under the atomic shadow, though live was perhaps too generous a word. It existed under the shadow. It carried on under the shadow. It raised children and built cities and made art and fell in love under the shadow, always with the knowledge that the shadow could become fire at any moment, that the delicate thread of deterrence could snap, that one miscalculation or accident or act of madness could end everything. The shadow changed people in ways both obvious and subtle. It appeared in the art and literature of the time, in novels about post-apocalyptic wastelands and films about mutants and monsters spawned by radiation. It shaped philosophy and theology, forcing thinkers to grapple with questions that previous generations never had to ask. What did morality mean in a world where mass murder on an unprecedented scale was not only possible but planned? What did the future mean when the future might not exist? And what did it say about humanity that it had created the means of its own extinction and then, instead of dismantling those means, had multiplied them and aimed them at each other, all while insisting it was acting rationally, acting in self-defense, acting to preserve peace? The atomic shadow fell longest and darkest on the generation that came of age during these years, the children who practiced duck and cover, who watched newsreels of mushroom clouds, who understood before they understood anything else that the world was fragile, that adults had made choices that put everyone at risk, and that there was nothing anyone could do but hope that the people in charge, the generals and politicians and scientists, would make the right decisions every single time, forever, without fail, because one mistake would be the last. It was a heavy inheritance, an anxiety baked into the foundation of consciousness, and it expressed itself in different ways in rebellion against authority, in dark humor that laughed at the absurdity of existence, in movements for peace and disarmament that grew throughout the 60s and 70s, and in a quiet resignation, a numbness, a sense that since the end could come at any moment, the only rational response was to stop thinking about it, to enjoy what you could while you could, to live fast because living at all was no longer guaranteed. The weapons themselves became objects of strange fascination, both revered and feared, worshipped and reviled. In America, atomic imagery seeped into popular culture in ways that now seem bizarre, darkly comic attempts to domesticate the undomestic, to make the apocalypse familiar. There were atomic cocktails served in bars, glowing green drinks with names that winked at annihilation. Beauty pageants crowned Miss Atomic Bomb, women posing in bathing suits with mushroom cloud hairstyles, smiling for cameras as though nuclear weapons were something to celebrate, something glamorous. Las Vegas marketed itself as Atomic City, inviting tourists to watch nuclear tests from hotel rooftops, hosting viewing parties where people gathered with champagne and binoculars to watch the desert light up with man-made suns. It was a kind of cultural fever dream, a society processing trauma through spectacle, trying to transform terror into entertainment because entertainment could be controlled, could be turned off, could be left behind when you went home. But beneath the kitsch and the bravado was something more unsettling, a collective dissociation, a splitting of the mind that allowed people to joke about extinction while building weapons to accomplish it, to normalize the abnormal because the alternative was to live in constant, paralyzing fear. Children's toys reflected this strange domestication. You could buy toy atomic bomb shelters, miniature models where plastic families waited out the apocalypse. Chemistry sets included actual radioactive materials, small amounts of uranium ore that glowed faintly in the dark, marketed as educational, as though children should grow up comfortable with radioactivity, familiar with the elements that could end the world. Comic books featured superheroes created by radiation accidents, gaining powers instead of cancers, turning mutation into a gift rather than a curse. Even cereal boxes offered prize as atomic rings and glow-in-the-dark badges, radiation rebranded as magic, as something exciting rather than lethal. Parents bought these things for their children, perhaps not thinking deeply about the messages being transmitted, or perhaps thinking very deeply and deciding that growing up comfortable with the atomic age was better than growing up terrified of it. But what did it do to a generation to be surrounded by this imagery? To have the language of annihilation woven so thoroughly into the fabric of everyday life that it ceased to shock, ceased even to register as strange. In schools, the curriculum adapted to include civil defense training alongside mathematics and history. Students learned about megatons and fallout patterns with the same dutiful attention they gave to multiplication tables. Educational films showed friendly narrators explaining how nuclear weapons worked, the science presented clearly, calmly, as though knowing the mechanics of your potential destruction was somehow empowering. One film featured a cartoon turtle named Bert who taught children to duck and cover, cheerfully demonstrating how to protect yourself from atomic blast by hiding under a blanket or behind a wall. The animation bright and cheerful, the message fundamentally dishonest. Teachers showed these films because they were required to, because the curriculum demanded it, but many of them must have felt the cognitive dissonance, the disconnect between the friendly cartoon and the reality it was supposedly preparing children for. Some teachers went through the motions numbly, treating civil defense like any other subject. Others tried to reassure their students that the drills were just precautions, that war was unlikely, that the adults were doing everything possible to keep everyone safe. But the children were not fooled. They saw the fear in their parents' eyes when the news reported another missile test, another diplomatic crisis. They heard the conversations that stopped when they entered the room. They understood that the duck and cover drills were theater, that if the bombs fell, the desks would not save them. But they practiced anyway because refusing to practice was somehow worse, was admitting that there was no hope at all. The psychological impact of living under constant threat was profound, though it often went unacknowledged at the time. Anxiety became baseline, a low hum of worry that people learned to carry without naming it, without recognizing it as anything other than the way things were. Studies conducted years later would show elevated rates of depression, anxiety disorders, and existential dread among people who came of age during the height of the Cold War. Their sense of security fundamentally damaged by growing up in a world where annihilation was always just 30 minutes away. Some people coped by becoming hypervigilant, monitoring the news obsessively, learning everything they could about weapons and strategy and diplomacy, as though information could provide control. Others coped through denial, refusing to think about nuclear weapons at all, changing the channel when the news turned to arms control, focusing on the immediate and tangible because the global and apocalyptic was too overwhelming. And still others found purpose in activism, joining movements that called for disarmament, for nuclear test bans, for peace, channeling their fear into action, believing that if enough people demanded change, the governments might listen, the weapons might be dismantled, the shadow might lift. The peace movements that emerged were diverse and passionate, united by the conviction that the arms race was madness, that humanity could not survive indefinitely under such conditions, that something had to change before accident or miscalculation or deliberate choice ended everything. In Britain, the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament organized massive protests, tens of thousands marching from nuclear weapons facilities to London, carrying banners with the peace symbol, that simple circle with 3 lines that became the universal icon of the anti-war movement. In the United States, groups like Women's Strike for Peace and the Committee for a Sane Nuclear Policy held vigils, wrote letters, lobbied politicians, organized boycotts of companies involved in weapons production. These activists were often dismissed by those in power as naive, as idealists who did not understand the realities of international politics, the necessities of deterrence, the fact that unilateral disarmament would leave one side vulnerable to the other. But the activists understood those arguments and rejected them, believing that the logic of deterrence was a trap, a self-fulfilling prophecy that normalized the insane and made it impossible to imagine any future other than permanent standoff or eventual catastrophe. The testing of nuclear weapons became a focal point for protest, particularly as the health effects became harder to deny. Scientists began publishing studies showing elevated cancer rates in communities downwind from test sites, genetic damage in children whose parents had been exposed to fallout, ecosystems poisoned by radioactive contamination that would persist for centuries. The images from the Pacific of islands obliterated, of indigenous peoples displaced and sickened, began to circulate more widely, and the moral calculus shifted. It was one thing to argue that nuclear weapons were necessary for defense, quite another to justify the ongoing harm being done to innocent people who had no say in the policies that endangered them. The pressure built slowly but steadily, activists and scientists and concerned citizens demanding an end to atmospheric testing, arguing that the tests could be conducted underground where the fallout would be contained, or better yet, not conducted at all. In 1963, after years of negotiations and public pressure, the United States, Soviet Union, and Britain signed the Partial Test Ban Treaty, agreeing to halt nuclear tests in the atmosphere, underwater, and in space. It was a limited victory. Underground testing continued for decades, but it was still a victory. Proof that public opinion could influence policy, that the governments were not entirely immune to moral arguments, that the shadow could, perhaps, be made slightly less dark. Yet even as atmospheric testing ended, the arsenals continued to grow. By the mid-1960s, the United States more than 30,000 nuclear warheads, the Soviet Union nearly as many, enough destructive power to destroy every major city on Earth multiple times over, to render the planet uninhabitable for any complex life. Military strategists spoke of overkill, the capacity to destroy targets that had already been destroyed, and the term was apt in ways they perhaps did not intend. It was overkill in the truest sense, excessive beyond reason, beyond strategy, beyond any conceivable purpose. What did it mean to have 30,000 warheads when a few hundred would suffice to end civilization? What strategic advantage did the 30,000th weapon provide that the 29,999th did not? The arms race had taken on a momentum of its own, driven by bureaucratic inertia, by defense contractors whose profits depended on perpetual production, by military leaders who measured their power by the size of their arsenals, by politicians who feared being accused of weakness if they suggested that perhaps enough was enough. And so the shadow deepened, year by year, warhead by warhead, until an entire generation had grown up knowing nothing else, until the shadow was simply the condition of existence, the backdrop against which all life unfolded. People made long-term plans despite the shadow, or perhaps because of it, asserting through their choices that the future was still worth investing in, that hope was an act of defiance against despair. They got married and had children. They bought houses and planted gardens. They saved for retirement, even though retirement might never come. And in these small, stubborn acts of normalcy, there was a kind of courage, a refusal to let the threat of annihilation dictate every moment, to let fear win completely. But the shadow was always there, in the back of the mind, in the news reports, in the missiles hidden in silos beneath the wheat fields of Montana and the steppes of Kazakhstan, in the submarines gliding silently through the depths, in the bombers on constant alert, ready to launch within minutes, their pilots living with the knowledge that they might be the ones to deliver the end, that the orders they had trained to follow might be the last orders anyone ever gave. The atomic shadow was not just a threat. It was a presence, a weight, a reshaping of what it meant to be human in the second half of the 20th century. It changed politics, art, psychology, philosophy, the very texture of daily life. And as the 1960s approached, as the arms race reached its terrifying peak, the world would discover just how close that shadow could come to becoming fire, how near the edge humanity could drift before pulling back, and whether the luck that had held so far could possibly last forever. Chapter 3: Spies, Lies, and the Invisible War. While diplomats shook hands in conference rooms and politicians delivered speeches about peace, another war was being fought in the margins, in the spaces between official history. A war without uniforms or battlefields, without declarations or truces. This was the war of secrets, of intelligence and counterintelligence, of agents who lived double lives and died without monuments, their sacrifices unrecorded, their betrayals unknown. It was a war fought in the shadows of every major city, in the embassies and universities and research laboratories, where information flowed like currency and loyalty was the most valuable commodity and the most easily counterfeited. The spies of the Cold War were not the glamorous figures of fiction, though some became famous, some became legends. Most were ordinary people who made extraordinary choices, who agreed for reasons noble or venal or desperate to serve two masters, to betray their countries or their causes, to live with the constant fear of exposure, knowing that discovery meant prison or death, or something worse, the erasure of their very identities, the rewriting of their stories to serve the narrative of whichever side captured them. The intelligence agencies that waged this invisible war grew enormous, sprawling bureaucracies with budgets hidden from public scrutiny, with agents scattered across the globe, with networks of informants and collaborators whose names filled filing cabinets in secure facilities where even the locations were classified. The Central Intelligence Agency, created in 1947 from the remnants of wartime intelligence operations, became the instrument of American power in the shadows, conducting operations that ranged from surveillance and analysis to coups and assassinations, activities that would have been unthinkable in peacetime, but that were justified by the perpetual emergency of the Cold War. The Soviet KGB, inheritor of the NKVD's brutal legacy, was equally vast, equally ruthless, its agents operating behind enemy lines, its informants embedded in Western governments and scientific institutions, its methods including blackmail, kidnapping, and murder, all sanctioned by a state that recognized no moral limits when the survival of communism was at stake. These agencies became states within states, answerable nominally to political leadership, but operating with such secrecy that oversight was often impossible, their actions hidden behind classifications that would not be lifted for decades, if ever. The recruitment of spies was an art form, a psychological seduction that preyed on vulnerability and idealism in equal measure. Some were recruited through ideology, true believers who thought they were serving a higher cause. Intellectuals who had become disillusioned with capitalism and saw in the Soviet Union a grand experiment worth protecting. Or conversely, Soviet citizens who had come to despise the tyranny they lived under and sought to help the West bring it down. Others were recruited through more base motivations: greed, ego, revenge, the thrill of playing a dangerous game. Intelligence officers would identify potential assets years before approaching them, studying their backgrounds, their relationships, their weaknesses, looking for leverage points for the right moment to make the pitch. A struggling academic with unpaid debts might be offered money. A junior diplomat passed over for promotion might be offered recognition, the chance to matter, to affect history in ways his official position never would. A scientist with access to classified research might be appealed to through ideology, convinced that his work should be shared with all humanity, not hoarded by one nation. And once the recruitment was made, once that first secret was passed, the asset was trapped, because now they had committed treason, and the only choices were to continue or to confess, and confession meant ruin. The most damaging spies were often those closest to the centers of power, the moles who burrowed into intelligence agencies themselves, feeding information back to the other side, compromising operations, betraying agents, turning the very organizations designed to protect national security into instruments of its betrayal. Kim Philby was perhaps the most famous of these, a British intelligence officer who rose to senior positions in MI6 while secretly working for the KGB from the 1930s onward. He was charming, brilliant, trusted by everyone, privy to the most sensitive Anglo-American intelligence operations, and for decades he passed it all to Moscow. The identities of Western agents operating in the Soviet Union, most of whom were subsequently arrested and executed. The details of covert operations that were then neutralized before they could succeed. The strategic assessments and policy debates that gave Soviet leaders insight into Western thinking. When Philby was finally exposed in 1963 and fled to Moscow, the damage was incalculable, not just in the intelligence he had compromised, but in the trust he had destroyed, the paranoia he had seeded. If someone like Philby could be a Soviet agent, who else might be? How deep did the penetration go? The counterintelligence investigations that followed consumed years and ruined careers, as agencies turned on themselves, hunting for moles real and imagined, the invisible war cannibalizing its own ranks. In America, the most infamous atomic spies were Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, a married couple accused of passing nuclear secrets to the Soviet Union during World War II. Their case became a lightning rod, a symbol of Cold War anxieties about betrayal from within. The evidence against Julius was substantial. He had indeed run a spy ring that transmitted classified information, including details about the atomic bomb project. The evidence against Ethel was much weaker, mostly the testimony of her brother, who was himself a spy seeking leniency. Nevertheless, both were convicted, and despite international appeals for clemency, despite protests that the death penalty was excessive, despite the questions about whether Ethel had been more victim than conspirator, both were executed in the electric chair in 1953. They were the first American civilians executed for espionage during peacetime, and their deaths sent a message that was impossible to miss. Betrayal would not be tolerated. Loyalty was not negotiable, and the state would exact the ultimate price from those who chose the wrong side. Their sons, orphaned by the executions, were raised by relatives, their childhood forever marked by their parents' choices and their country's vengeance, living symbols of how the Cold War consumed individuals, how it turned families into casualties, how the invisible war had very visible victims. The techniques of espionage evolved constantly, each side developing new methods of concealment and communication. Each breakthrough met with a new countermeasure. Dead drops replaced face-to-face meetings, agents leaving microfilm or documents in hollow rocks or buried containers that their handlers would retrieve later, minimizing the risk of surveillance catching them together. Invisible ink, microdots, encrypted shortwave radio transmissions all became tools of the trade. Later, as technology advanced, spy satellites orbiting overhead could photograph military installations with resolution fine enough to count vehicles, to track troop movements, to monitor the construction of missile silos. The skies became another battlefield in the invisible war, and the Soviet Union shot down American spy planes when it could. The most famous incident being the downing of Francis Gary Powers' U-2 aircraft in 1960 over Soviet territory. Powers survived and was captured. His trial, a propaganda spectacle where he admitted to espionage, where the Soviets displayed the wreckage of his plane and the cameras he had used to photograph their secrets. The incident was deeply embarrassing for the United States, which had initially denied that it conducted such flights, and it torpedoed a planned summit between Eisenhower and Khrushchev. The invisible war once again disrupting the visible diplomacy, proving that trust between the superpowers was impossible when each was constantly violating the other's sovereignty in pursuit of intelligence. The invisible war was not fought only between the superpowers. It extended into every corner of the globe, into nations that considered themselves neutral, into countries that had no desire to choose sides but found themselves chosen anyway, their governments infiltrated, their political movements manipulated, their futures decided in Moscow or Washington by men who had never walked their streets or spoken their languages. The developing world became a chessboard where the superpowers played for influence, each viewing every political movement through the lens of Cold War competition, unable to see local struggles as anything other than extensions of the global conflict. Nationalist movements seeking independence from colonial rule were sorted into categories, pro-Western or pro-Soviet, capitalist or communist, as though the complexities of their aspirations could be reduced to binary choices, as though their histories and grievances and hopes mattered less than which superpower they might align with. In Iran, in 1953, when Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh nationalized the country's oil industry, threatening British petroleum interests and, by extension, Western influence in the region, the CIA and British intelligence orchestrated a coup. Operation Ajax, as it was called, used propaganda, bribery, and orchestrated protests to destabilize Mossadegh's government, turning public opinion against him, creating chaos in the streets until the military was convinced to intervene and restore the Shah to absolute power. The coup succeeded brilliantly from an operational standpoint. Mossadegh was overthrown. The oil flowed again to Western companies. Iran remained firmly in the Western camp. But the cost was the subversion of Iranian democracy, the installation of an autocratic ruler whose secret police would terrorize the population for decades, and the seeding of resentments that would eventually erupt in the 1979 revolution, when those resentments turned violently against the United States and everything it represented. The invisible war had visible consequences, ripples that spread across decades, choices made in secret producing outcomes that shaped the future in ways the planners never anticipated or intended. In Guatemala the following year, history repeated itself with different names, but the same logic. President Jacobo Renz had implemented land reforms, redistributing unused land from large estates. including land owned by the United Fruit Company, an American corporation with enormous influence in Washington. The CIA, viewing Rebens as a communist threat, launched Operation Padsucks, a campaign of psychological warfare, economic sabotage, and paramilitary invasion that toppled his government and installed a military regime friendly to American interests. The new government reversed the land reforms, returned the property to United Fruit, and began a campaign of repression against leftist groups that would escalate into decades of civil war and genocide. With hundreds of thousands of Guatemalans killed, most of them indigenous people caught between government forces and guerrillas, their deaths traceable back to that initial intervention, to the decision that corporate interests and Cold War paranoia mattered more than Guatemalan lives or sovereignty, or the right of a nation to determine its own path. These operations became templates, models repeated with variations across the developing world. In the Congo, when Patrice Lumumba, the first democratically elected prime minister, seemed too friendly with the Soviet Union, the CIA plotted his assassination, and though the agency's own operatives did not pull the trigger, they facilitated his capture and transfer to enemies who murdered him, his death clearing the way for Mobutu Sese Seko, a dictator who would loot the country for decades while remaining a loyal American ally. In Chile, when Salvador Allende was democratically elected as a Marxist president, the United States funded opposition groups, supported a military coup, and helped install Augusto Pinochet, whose regime disappeared thousands of people, tortured tens of thousands more, and destroyed Chilean democracy for 17 years. Each intervention was justified as necessary, as preventing Soviet expansion, as protecting American interests, as defending freedom, though the freedom being defended often seemed to apply more to corporations and military bases than to the people actually living in these countries, the people who suffered the coups and the repression and the wars that followed. The Soviet Union conducted its own interventions with equal ruthlessness and even less pretense of ideological consistency. In Hungary in 1956, when popular protests erupted against Soviet control, when the government announced its intention to withdraw from the Warsaw Pact and pursue neutrality, Soviet tanks rolled into Budapest and crushed the uprising with brutal efficiency. Thousands were killed, thousands more imprisoned. The revolution drowned in blood as the world watched and did nothing. Western governments issuing statements of condemnation but taking no action, because Hungary was in the Soviet sphere of influence and intervening would risk war. The Hungarian people learned the lesson that dissidents everywhere would learn throughout the Cold War, that resistance against the superpowers was futile without external support, and external support would not come if it threatened the stability of the larger balance, that their freedom mattered less than the maintenance of spheres of influence, that they were expendable in the calculations of great power politics. 12 years later, in Czechoslovakia, the pattern repeated. The Prague Spring of 1968, a brief flowering of political liberalization under Alexander Dubček, promised socialism with a human face, a middle path between Soviet authoritarianism and Western capitalism. For a few months, it seemed possible press censorship lifted, political prisoners released, debate flourishing in streets and universities, a sense that change was not only necessary but achievable. Then, in August, Warsaw Pact forces invaded, 500,000 troops and thousands of tanks occupying the country, arresting reformers, reimposing control, ending the experiment. The resistance was mostly nonviolent students sitting in front of tanks, citizens arguing with soldiers, radio stations broadcasting from secret locations until they were found and silenced. The world watched again, protested again, did nothing again. The message was clear. The Soviet Union would tolerate no deviation within its sphere, no experiment that might inspire others, no suggestion that there was any alternative to the system it had imposed. The invisible war maintained its borders through visible force, and those borders were written in blood and enforced by overwhelming military power whenever influence and manipulation proved insufficient. The intelligence services fought each other through proxies and surrogates, arming and training guerrilla movements, insurgents and counterinsurgents, turning local conflicts into extensions of the global struggle. In Afghanistan, before the Soviet invasion, the KGB worked to support the communist government against Islamic rebels. In Angola, Cuban troops backed by Soviet arms fought against rebels supported by the CIA and South Africa. In Nicaragua, the CIA trained and funded the Contras against the Sandinista government, mining harbors, organizing attacks, conducting what amounted to a secret war that Congress knew little about and the American public even less. These proxy wars killed millions, most of them civilians caught in the crossfire, people whose lives were destroyed by weapons they did not choose, by conflicts that served interests far removed from their own struggles and aspirations. Villages were burned, families displaced, entire generations grew up knowing only war, and the superpowers provided the guns and the money and the training while maintaining the fiction that they were not directly involved, that these were local conflicts, organic rebellions, when in truth they were Cold War battlefields where the dying was outsourced to populations that could least afford it. The human cost of the invisible war was impossible to calculate because so much of it remained hidden, classified, denied. How many agents died in the field, betrayed by moles or caught by counterintelligence? Their bodies never recovered. Their families told only that they had died in accidents or disappeared on business trips. How many political prisoners languished in cells because they had been identified by informants, because their names appeared on lists compiled by foreign intelligence agencies and passed to local security forces? How many coups and assassinations and acts of sabotage shaped history in ways that historians would never fully understand? Because the documents remained sealed, the operatives remained silent, the truth remained locked in archives that might not be opened for generations, if ever. The invisible war left no memorials, no tomb of the unknown spy, no national days of remembrance. Its casualties were erased from official records, their sacrifices unacknowledged, their stories untold except in whispers and rumors, in the occasional defector's memoir or journalist's expose that revealed fragments of the larger picture but could never capture its full scope. And yet, for all its secrecy, the invisible war shaped the visible world profoundly. It determined which governments rose and fell, which movements succeeded and which were crushed before they could begin, which nations remained independent and which became client states, their sovereignty theoretical, but their policies dictated from abroad. It created a climate of perpetual suspicion where no one could be entirely trusted, where even allies spied on each other, where embassies were bugged and diplomats followed, where private conversations were recorded and filed away for potential future use. It corrupted institutions as intelligence agencies accumulated power without accountability, as covert operations became normal rather than exceptional, as lying to the public and to Congress became standard practice justified by national security, that elastic phrase that could be stretched to cover almost any action, any excess, any crime committed in the name of protecting the state. The spies themselves lived lives of peculiar intensity, split between their public personas and their secret allegiances, never able to fully relax. never able to trust even those closest to them. Some thrived in this duality, finding excitement in the danger, satisfaction in the deception, a sense of importance in knowing that their actions, however small they might seem, contributed to something larger, something that mattered in the grand contest between East and West. Others deteriorated under the strain, the constant fear of exposure eating away at their peace of mind, the guilt accumulating with each piece of information passed, each friend betrayed, each lie told to people they loved. The best spies were those who could compartmentalize completely, who could be loving parents and loyal colleagues and devoted patriots while simultaneously serving the enemy, who could hold contradictory identities without psychological collapse. But such people were rare, and the intelligence agencies spent enormous resources trying to identify them, recruit them, train them to manage the cognitive dissonance that came with betrayal as a profession. The training of intelligence operatives was rigorous, designed to prepare them for every contingency, to teach them not just the technical skills of espionage, but the psychological techniques required to survive in hostile environments. They learned to create and maintain cover identities, to build backstories convincing enough to withstand scrutiny, to remember lies as though they were truth because a single inconsistency could unravel everything. They learned surveillance and counter-surveillance, how to detect when they were being followed, how to lose a tail in crowded streets or subway systems, how to use reflections in windows to monitor what was happening behind them. They learned dead drops in brush passes, the seemingly accidental encounters where information or money changed hands in seconds without anyone watching realizing that a transaction had occurred. They learned to resist interrogation, to withstand psychological pressure and physical pain without breaking, though the training could only simulate so much, and those who were actually captured often discovered that reality was far worse than any training had prepared them for. For Soviet operatives captured in the West, the consequences were usually imprisonment, years or decades in secure facilities, sometimes followed by exchange and spy swaps, where both sides traded captured agents in carefully negotiated deals conducted on bridges or at border crossings. Ceremonies of mutual release that acknowledged the invisible war's existence while maintaining the fiction that it was conducted according to certain rules. But for Western agents captured in the Soviet Union or its satellite states, the consequences were often more severe. Torture was common, not just physical but psychological sleep deprivation, isolation, relentless interrogation designed to break the mind as much as the body. Show trials followed, where the accused confessed to crimes real and imagined, where the proceedings were theater designed to demonstrate Soviet vigilance and Western perfidy, where the verdicts were decided before the trials began. Executions were frequent, carried out in prison basements with a bullet to the back of the head, the bodies cremated, the families sometimes not notified for years, sometimes never told at all, left to wonder whether their loved ones were dead or simply being held in some remote camp beyond contact, beyond hope. The paranoia generated by the invisible war infected entire societies. In the United States, loyalty oaths became common, required for government employees, teachers, union members, anyone whose position might offer opportunities for subversion. People were asked to swear they were not communists, had never been communists, did not associate with communists, did not sympathize with communist goals. The questions probing deeper into political beliefs and associations than any democratic society should tolerate, but tolerated nonetheless because the threat seemed to justify the intrusion, because rooting out subversion seemed more important than protecting civil liberties. Those who refused to sign the oaths, even on principle, often lost their jobs, were blacklisted, found themselves unemployable, their refusal taken as evidence of disloyalty, even when their actual politics were moderate or even conservative. The oaths created a climate where conformity was safety, where expressing unpopular opinions was dangerous, where the invisible war against external enemies became a visible war against internal dissent. In the Soviet Union, the paranoia was even more pervasive and deadly. The KGB maintained vast networks of informants, ordinary citizens who reported on their neighbors, co-workers, family members, anyone whose words or actions seemed suspicious, whose loyalty seemed questionable. The informants were everywhere, in apartment buildings, in workplaces, in universities, in social clubs, and because you never knew who might be reporting, the safest course was to trust no one, to speak carefully, even in private, to avoid any conversation that might be construed as criticism of the state or the party or the system. The KGB's files grew to enormous proportions, millions of pages documenting the mundane details of ordinary lives, the reports often saying more about the informant's biases and personal grudges than about any actual threat to state security. But the mere existence of the surveillance apparatus was itself a form of control, making everyone complicit, turning citizens into participants in their own oppression, creating a society where fear was so thoroughly internalized that external enforcement became almost unnecessary. The most effective spies were often those who appeared most unlikely, who seemed too ordinary, too harmless, too loyal to ever be suspected. The American couple living quietly in suburban New Jersey, teaching their children baseball and attending PTA meetings, who were actually Soviet illegals, deep cover agents living under false identities for years or decades, waiting for activation, gathering information slowly, patiently, embedding themselves so thoroughly in American life that their neighbors would never believe the truth, even after they were arrested. The trusted secretary in a government ministry, unremarkable and efficient, who photographed documents after hours and passed them to her handler, her access granted by invisibility, by being so reliable that no one thought to question her loyalty. The scientist, driven not by ideology but by ego, who resented not receiving the recognition he believed he deserved and found satisfaction in the attention paid by foreign intelligence officers who told him how valuable his work was, how much it was appreciated, how history would remember his contributions even if his own country did not. Some operations achieved legendary status, stories that grew in the telling, becoming part of the mythology of the intelligence services. The Berlin Tunnel, constructed in the mid-1950s by British and American intelligence, was an engineering marvel, a tunnel stretching nearly half a kilometer from West Berlin into East Berlin, tapped into Soviet communication cables, allowing Western intelligence to monitor thousands of conversations, to gather enormous amounts of intelligence about Soviet military dispositions and political intentions. For nearly a year, the operation was spectacularly successful, the information flowing back to Washington and London seeming to provide unprecedented insight into Soviet thinking. Then the Soviets discovered the tunnel, or rather, they revealed that they had known about it from the beginning, having been informed by George Blake, a British intelligence officer who was actually a Soviet mole. Blake had betrayed the operation before it even began, and the Soviets had let it continue, feeding disinformation through the cables they knew were tapped, turning the West's intelligence triumph into a Soviet counterintelligence victory. The revelation, when it came years later after Blake's exposure and escape to Moscow, was devastating, another reminder that in the invisible war, nothing was as it seemed. Success was often failure in disguise, and the enemy was always closer than you thought. The toll on those who lived this life was immense. Aldrich Ames, a CIA officer who spied for the Soviet Union and later Russia for nearly a decade, betrayed dozens of American agents operating in the Soviet Union, leading directly to at least 10 executions and the imprisonment of many others. He did it for money initially, to pay off debts, to fund a lifestyle he could not otherwise afford, but he continued doing it for years. Long after the initial financial pressure had passed, perhaps because stopping would have meant admitting what he had done, facing the enormity of his betrayal, confronting the knowledge that men had died because of him, that families had been destroyed by his greed. When he was finally caught in 1994, after the Cold War had ended, his psychological evaluation revealed someone who had compartmentalized so completely that he could participate in CIA, counterintelligence meetings to hunt for the mole he knew was himself, who could sit across from colleagues whose agents he had condemned to death and show no outward sign of guilt or stress. He was sentenced to life in prison, and he remains there still, a man who gained money and lost everything else, his freedom, his reputation, his humanity, all for secrets that, in the end, changed nothing, that contributed to a victory the Soviet Union never achieved, that served a cause that collapsed before he was even arrested. Robert Hansen presented an even stranger case, an FBI agent who spied for Soviet and Russian intelligence for more than 20 years, from 1979 until his arrest in 2001, one of the longest-running and most damaging penetrations in American history. Unlike Ames, who was dissolute and obvious in his newfound wealth, Hansen was careful, disciplined, devout in his Catholicism even as he betrayed his country, attending church regularly, raising his children in the faith, his outward life the picture of conservative respectability. His motivations were never entirely clear. Money played a role, but he was never extravagant, never drew attention to himself. Some who studied him concluded that it was intellectual vanity, the thrill of outwitting his colleagues, of being smarter than the system designed to catch people like him, of holding a secret so enormous that knowing it set him apart from everyone around him. His arrest came only after a retired KGB officer sold his file to American intelligence, and even then, the FBI had to conduct an elaborate sting operation, feeding him false information and watching where it went before they could be certain and make the arrest. He too received life in prison, solitary confinement, 23 hours a day in a cell, the rest of his life to contemplate what he had done and why, though by all accounts he has never fully explained it. Perhaps because even he does not entirely understand the psychology that allowed him to live such a fundamental contradiction for so long. The invisible war finally began to wind down as the Cold War itself drew to a close, but it never truly ended. Intelligence agencies on both sides scaled back some operations, opened some archives, acknowledged some of what had been done in the decades of shadow conflict. Former enemies sometimes met in academic conferences or documentary interviews, old adversaries now gray and retired, discussing operations they had conducted against each other with something approaching professional respect. The animosity faded, but the memories still vivid, still painful. They spoke of close calls and clever deceptions, of colleagues lost and operations blown, of the constant tension of living with secrets, and in their reminiscences, there was often a note of something like regret, not for serving their countries, but for the waste of it all, the recognition that so much effort and talent and life had been poured into a struggle that in retrospect seemed to have accomplished little except to perpetuate itself, to justify its own existence, to create a perpetual state of conflict that served institutional interests more than national ones. The invisible war left its deepest marks not in the operations that succeeded, but in the trust that was destroyed, in the institutions that were corrupted, in the precedents that were set. It normalized lying to the public, keeping Congress in the dark, conducting operations that violated international law and domestic principles, all justified by the eternal emergency of the Cold War, the argument that normal rules could not apply when the enemy was existential and the stakes were civilizational. And even after the Cold War ended, those habits persisted. Those institutions remained. Those powers continued to be exercised because once granted, power is rarely surrendered voluntarily, and the invisible war had created an entire apparatus that had learned to operate in darkness, to answer to no one, to do what it deemed necessary and call it patriotism, regardless of cost, regardless of consequences, regardless of whether the threat it claimed to be fighting was real or simply the justification for its own continuation. Chapter 4. The World on the Brink. October 1962. Autumn in Washington, the leaves turning gold and red, the air carrying that first hint of cold that promises winter. It should have been an ordinary month, a season of transition, children back in school, politicians preparing for midterm elections, life proceeding with its usual rhythms. Instead, it became 13 days when the world held its breath, when humanity stood closer to its own extinction than it ever had before or has since, when the Cold War nearly turned hot, when the abstract threat of nuclear annihilation became terrifyingly concrete. The crisis began quietly, with photographs taken from high altitude, spy plane images that revealed something unexpected on the island of Cuba, just 90 miles from the Florida coast. Soviet missiles. Medium-range ballistic missiles capable of carrying nuclear warheads being assembled at launch sites carved out of Cuban jungle pointed north toward American cities. The discovery changed everything. For months, American intelligence had suspected Soviet military buildup in Cuba, but this was different. These were not defensive weapons. These were offensive, first-strike weapons that could reach Washington in minutes, that could decapitate American leadership before warning systems even registered the launch, that fundamentally altered the balance of power and put the United States in a position it had never faced before: vulnerable, exposed, with enemy nuclear weapons positioned on its doorstep. President John F. Kennedy received the intelligence on the morning of October 16th, and the photographs were undeniable. There were the missiles, there were the launch pads, there were the patterns. Soviet forces used everywhere. They deployed nuclear weapons. Unmistakable once you knew what you were looking for. Kennedy assembled a small group of advisors, the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, EXCOM for short. And for the next several days they met in secret, debating options, gaming out scenarios, trying to find a path between capitulation and catastrophe. The options were limited and none were good. They could do nothing except the missiles as a fait accompli, but that would embolden the Soviets, would be seen as weakness, would invite further provocations. They could negotiate, try to reach an understanding with Khrushchev, but what could they offer? And why would the Soviets remove the missiles when they had gone to such lengths to install them? They could launch a surgical airstrike, destroy the missile sites before they became operational. But intelligence suggested they might not get all the missiles, and any strike would kill Soviet personnel, which could trigger retaliation, which could escalate rapidly beyond anyone's control. Or they could invade Cuba, eliminate the Castro regime that had invited Soviet missiles in the first place, but an invasion would take time to organize and would certainly provoke Soviet response, possibly in Berlin, possibly elsewhere, possibly everywhere. The Joint Chiefs of Staff favored military action, invasion preferably, airstrikes at minimum. Their logic straightforward. The missiles were intolerable. They must be removed, and diplomacy had failed to prevent their installation, so force was the only language the Soviets would understand. General Curtis LeMay, the Air Force chief, was particularly hawkish, arguing that the United States should strike immediately, that waiting only gave the Soviets time to make the missiles operational, that hesitation was more dangerous than action. Kennedy listened but resisted, unconvinced that military strikes could be surgical, aware that once shooting started, controlling the escalation would be nearly impossible. He had read Barbara Tuchman's The Guns of August, A History of How World War. I began through miscalculation and rigid mobilization plans that left no room for diplomacy, and he feared repeating that catastrophe on a nuclear scale, where the consequences would be measured not in millions dead, but in civilizations ended. He chose instead a middle path, a naval blockade of Cuba that he called a quarantine, to avoid the legally provocative term blockade, which was technically an act of war. American warships would form a ring around Cuba and prevent any further Soviet military shipments from reaching the island. It was a show of force that stopped short of direct attack, a warning that gave Khrushchev a chance to back down without immediate violence, though everyone understood that if Soviet ships tried to run the blockade, if they refused to stop when ordered, American ships would have to fire, and then the crisis would enter a new and far more dangerous phase. On the evening of October 22nd, Kennedy addressed the nation, his voice steady but grave, explaining the situation in terms everyone could understand. Soviet missiles were in Cuba. They could reach American cities. This was unacceptable. The United States was establishing a quarantine and demanding the missiles be removed. Any nuclear missile launched from Cuba would be regarded as a Soviet attack on the United States, requiring full retaliation against the Soviet Union. The message was clear: turn back or face consequences that neither side could control. Americans watched the speech and then looked at each other, at their children, at their homes, and wondered if this was the beginning of the end. If Kennedy's words had just set in motion events that would culminate in mushroom clouds over American cities, over Soviet cities, over every city that mattered, until nothing remained but radioactive ruins and the slow death of everything. The panic was muted, controlled, everyone trying to maintain normalcy while processing the enormity of what they had just heard. But beneath the surface, terror rippled through the population like a current, invisible but undeniable. In Moscow, Nikita Khrushchev faced his own calculations, his own impossible choices. He had placed the missiles in Cuba for several reasons: to protect Castro's regime from American invasion, to demonstrate Soviet strength and willingness to project power, to redress the strategic imbalance created by American missiles stationed in Turkey on the Soviet border. The installation had been done secretly, quickly, the missiles transported in cargo holds beneath deck, assembled under cover of night, the Soviets gambling that by the time the Americans discovered them, they would be operational and irreversible, facts that would have to be accepted. But the Americans had discovered them early, before they were fully ready, and now Kennedy had called their bluff. Khrushchev could order his ships to run the blockade, could test American resolve, but if shooting started, if Soviet sailors died, how could he not retaliate? And if he retaliated, how could Kennedy not respond? The escalation ladder stretched before him, each rung leading inevitably to the next. The logic of brinkmanship, pushing both sides toward an abyss neither wanted, but both seemed unable to avoid. He sent messages to Kennedy, some conciliatory, some defiant, the inconsistency reflecting the debate raging within the Kremlin. Hardliners arguing for strength, moderates arguing for caution, Khrushchev himself vacillating between positions, trying to find a way out that did not look like surrender, but that avoided the war he knew would destroy everything. Soviet ships approached the quarantine line, 20 vessels carrying military cargo, escorted by submarines, their orders to proceed, their crews aware that they were sailing into a confrontation that could ignite World War III. American destroyers took up positions, their crews at battle stations, their orders to enforce the quarantine, to stop and search any vessel that did not turn back, to use force if necessary. The morning of October 24th, the world watched and waited. In the White House Situation Room, Kennedy and his advisors monitored reports, tracking the Soviet ships on maps, calculating distances, estimating when the first contact would occur. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara stood at the map, his finger tracing the lines of approach, and someone asked what would happen when the ships met. McNamara said quietly that the Navy would signal the Soviet ships to stop, and if they did not stop, the Navy would fire a shot across the bow, and if they still did not stop, the Navy would fire to disable, and then no one knew what would happen, because no one had ever fought a naval battle between nuclear superpowers. No one knew if one side would escalate to nuclear weapons rather than accept defeat. No one knew if the submarines lurking beneath the surface had orders to launch their torpedoes, possibly nuclear-tipped torpedoes, if their ships were attacked. Then, at the last possible moment, the Soviet ships stopped. They slowed, they turned, they held position just outside the quarantine line, waiting for new orders from Moscow, unwilling to cross the threshold that would turn crisis into combat. In the Situation Room, someone exhaled audibly, the tension breaking for just a moment, and Secretary of State Dean Rusk turned to McGeorge Bundy and said softly, "We're eyeball to eyeball, and I think the other fellow just blinked." It was a reprieve, not a resolution, a pause in the escalation, but not an end to the crisis. The ships had stopped, but the missiles were still in Cuba, still being assembled. Intelligence suggesting they would be operational within days, if not hours. The clock was still ticking. Kennedy ordered the quarantine maintained, the surveillance flights continued, the pressure sustained. And in Moscow, Khrushchev wrestled with his next move, knowing he had backed down once, knowing that backing down again would be seen as weakness, as capitulation, as proof that Soviet power was hollow, but also knowing that continuing the confrontation risked everything, not just his political position, but the survival of his country, of the human species itself. What the world did not know, what even Kennedy did not know until much later, was how close the crisis came to spiraling out of control, not through deliberate decision, but through accident, through miscommunication, through the fog of crisis that made every small incident potentially catastrophic. On October 27th, a day that would later be called Black Saturday, everything seemed to converge at once, multiple near misses accumulating within hours. A U-2 spy plane strayed accidentally into Soviet airspace over Siberia. Soviet fighters scrambled to intercept it. American fighters scrambled to protect it. The incident resolved only when the U-2 pilot realized his navigation error and turned back. But for those minutes, Soviet air defense wondered if this was the first wave of an American attack. If the reconnaissance plane was actually a bomber, if they should assume war had begun and respond accordingly. Another U-2, this one flying over Cuba, was shot down by a Soviet surface-to-air missile, the pilot killed, the wreckage falling into Cuban soil. The shootdown violated Khrushchev's orders. He had not authorized firing on American aircraft, but the Soviet commander on the ground had made the decision himself, fearing the reconnaissance was preparation for invasion, acting on his own initiative in the heat of the moment. And now an American pilot was dead, and the Joint Chiefs were demanding retaliation, demanding that the SAM site be destroyed, demanding action that would almost certainly kill Soviet personnel and escalate the crisis to the next level. Beneath the waters of the Caribbean, Soviet submarines prowled in the heat and darkness, their batteries running low, their air growing foul, their crews exhausted and stressed beyond endurance. These were diesel submarines, not nuclear, and they needed to surface regularly to recharge their batteries and refresh their air. But doing so exposed them to American detection, to American warships that surrounded them, that dropped practice depth charges to signal that they knew the submarines were there, to force them to surface and identify themselves. The depth charges were not meant to destroy, only to harass, but the Soviet crews had no way of knowing that, no way of distinguishing practice charges from real attacks. And as the explosions reverberated through their hulls, as their captains listened to the pinging of American sonar closing in, some of them began to believe they were under genuine attack, that war had started above while they were submerged and uninformed. Each submarine carried nuclear-tipped torpedoes, weapons they were authorized to use if they believed their ship was being sunk, if communication with Moscow had been lost, if they concluded that war was underway and their only option was to retaliate. On one submarine, B-59, the conditions became unbearable. The heat inside reached 140 degrees Fahrenheit. The crew collapsing from heat exhaustion, the carbon dioxide levels dangerous. The captain driven nearly to madness by the pressure and the isolation and the relentless American harassment. The Americans dropped more depth charges, the submarine shook, and Captain Valentin Savitsky believed they were being attacked, believed that World War III had begun on the surface while they were trapped below, and he ordered the nuclear torpedo prepared for firing. His words were desperate, furious. They are forcing us to attack. We're going to blast them now. We will die, but we will sink them all. The nuclear torpedo was readied. The target selected, the aircraft carrier USS Randolph and the destroyers surrounding it. A single nuclear explosion would have vaporized the American ships, would have killed thousands of sailors, and almost certainly would have triggered immediate American nuclear retaliation. The assumption being that a nuclear attack, even a tactical one, represented the beginning of all-out war. The world came within a single command of nuclear exchange, within seconds of the threshold being crossed, and the only thing that prevented it was the presence aboard B-59 of Vasily Arkhipov, a brigade chief of staff who happened to be on that particular submarine, whose approval was required by regulations for nuclear weapons launch and who refused to give it. Arkhipov argued with his captain, urged restraint, insisted they surface and await orders rather than launching on their own initiative. The argument was heated, the captain arguing they were under attack and had no choice. Arkhipov countering that they did not know for certain what was happening above, that firing would mean certain death for all of them and possibly for millions more. But they must surface and find out what was actually occurring before taking an action that could never be reversed. Somehow, impossibly, Arkhipov prevailed. The order to fire was rescinded. The submarine surfaced, identified itself, and was allowed to leave the area. The world never knew how close it had come, never knew that one man's refusal had saved everything, that if Arkhipov had not been aboard that particular submarine, if regulations had not required his consent, if the captain's rage had carried the moment, the Cold War would have ended not with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, but with the destruction of human civilization. Arkhipov died in 1998, relatively unknown, his role in preventing nuclear war not widely recognized until years after his death. But he may have been the most important person in the 20th century, the man whose refusal to panic, whose insistence on verification before retaliation, whose stubborn rationality in the most irrational of circumstances allowed there to be a 21st century at all. Back in Washington and Moscow, leaders who knew nothing of the submarine crisis were trying to find a way out of the larger confrontation, their communications growing more urgent, more personal, the formality of diplomatic language giving way to something rawer, more honest. Khrushchev sent a long, rambling letter on October 26th, its tone almost pleading, describing the crisis as a knot that was pulling tighter with each passing hour, saying that if both leaders continued to pull, the knot would become so tight that eventually someone would have to cut it, and cutting it meant war, meant destruction, meant the end of everything they had built and everything they had hoped for. He proposed a deal. The Soviet Union would remove the missiles from Cuba if the United States promised never to invade Cuba, if Kennedy would guarantee Castro's survival and Cuba's sovereignty. It seemed like an opening, a path to resolution, and Kennedy's advisors began drafting a response accepting the offer. But then a second letter arrived on October 27th, more formal, more demanding, insisting that any deal include the removal of American missiles from Turkey, making the exchange explicit: Soviet missiles in Cuba for American missiles in Turkey, a swap that would preserve Soviet prestige and give Khrushchev something to show his hardliners. The Turkish missiles complicated everything. They were obsolete, already scheduled for quiet removal, but doing so publicly as part of a deal would look like capitulation, would seem like the United States was willing to trade the security of an ally, would set a precedent that American commitments could be bargained away under pressure. Kennedy decided on a sophisticated response, one that would give Khrushchev a way out while maintaining American credibility. Publicly, he accepted the first letter's terms, missiles removed from Cuba, in exchange for a no-invasion pledge. Privately, through his brother Robert, he conveyed to the Soviet ambassador that the Turkish missiles would be removed within a few months, but that this could not be part of any public agreement, could not be acknowledged as a quid pro quo, had to remain secret. If Khrushchev publicly insisted on the Turkish missiles, if he made it a formal condition, Kennedy would have to refuse and the crisis would continue. But if Khrushchev accepted the public deal and trusted the private assurance, both sides could claim victory. Both sides could step back from the edge. Both sides could survive politically while avoiding the war neither wanted. Khrushchev accepted. On the morning of October 28th, Radio Moscow broadcast his response. The Soviet Union would dismantle the missiles and remove them from Cuba, would do so under international inspection, would step back in the interest of peace. The crisis was over. In Washington, in Moscow, in cities around the world, people exhaled, some crying with relief, some still not quite believing they had survived, that the world was still here, that tomorrow would come after all. The relief was overwhelming, physical, like a fever breaking. Children went to school and their teachers struggled to focus on lessons when all anyone wanted to do was celebrate being alive, being safe, being granted another chance. Churches filled with people giving thanks, bars filled with people drinking to survival, streets filled with people who just needed to be around others to share the collective relief, to process together what they had just endured. But even as the relief washed over the world, even as the tension released and life began to resume its familiar patterns, those who had lived through the crisis most intimately, who had sat in the rooms where decisions were made, who had seen how close the edge truly was, carried a different understanding. They knew things the public did not know, would not know for decades. They knew about the submarines and the nuclear torpedoes, about Arkapov's refusal that had saved everything. They knew how many times miscommunication had nearly triggered catastrophe, how many small errors had almost cascaded into apocalypse. They knew that the resolution had depended on luck as much as wisdom, that if circumstances had been slightly different, if personalities had been slightly different, if any of 100 variables had shifted just a little, the outcome would have been unimaginable horror rather than peaceful resolution. Kennedy said afterward that he thought the chances of nuclear war during the crisis had been between 1 in 3 and even odds that no rational person would accept for anything, yet they had accepted them because the alternatives had seemed impossible, because once the crisis began, the logic of it had taken over, pulling everyone toward confrontation whether they wanted it or not. Robert Kennedy wrote later that during the worst moments, he had thought about his children, about all the children, about the world they would inherit if the crisis went wrong. And he had wondered what future generations would think of the leaders who had brought humanity to such a precipice, who had built weapons capable of ending civilization and then placed them in positions where a single miscalculation could unleash them. He wrote that the crisis had changed him fundamentally, that he could never again see nuclear weapons as abstract strategic tools, that he understood now in his bones what they truly were, instruments of annihilation that served no rational purpose, that protected nothing because using them meant destroying everything, including whatever you thought you were protecting. His account, published after his own assassination in 1968, became one of the most important documents of the Cold War, a testament from inside the crisis, from someone who had helped navigate it, who had seen Kennedy's private anguish and Khrushchev's desperation, and the joint recognition that they were playing a game with rules neither fully understood, stakes neither could truly comprehend, and consequences that would extend far beyond their own lives or nations if they failed. The aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis changed the Cold War in subtle but significant ways. Both superpowers had looked into the abyss and stepped back, and that shared experience created a strange kind of bond, a mutual understanding that whatever their ideological differences, whatever their competing interests, they shared an interest in survival that transcended everything else. The hotline was installed shortly after, a direct communication link between Washington and Moscow, a red phone in popular imagination, though it was actually a teletype machine, a way for leaders to communicate instantly during crises rather than waiting for messages to be transmitted through diplomatic channels, translated, interpreted, delayed by hours when minutes might matter. It was a small change, technical rather than political, but it symbolized something important, the recognition that managing the relationship, preventing misunderstanding, Maintaining control over events was more important than winning points in the ideological struggle, that the game had become too dangerous to play without some basic agreements about rules and communication. Arms control negotiations began to be taken seriously in ways they had not been before. The Partial Test Ban Treaty, signed in 1963, ended atmospheric nuclear testing and represented the first meaningful constraint both sides had accepted on their weapons programs. It was not disarmament. Underground testing continued. Arsenals continued to grow, but it was a start, an acknowledgement that unlimited competition served no one's interests, that the arms race had taken on a life of its own that needed to be controlled before it controlled everyone. The treaty negotiations were difficult, each side suspicious of the other's intentions, verification mechanisms debated endlessly, but eventually both recognized that the alternative was worse, that continuing to poison the atmosphere with fallout while building ever larger arsenals was madness, and that even adversaries could cooperate when cooperation served mutual survival. Yet for all the changes, the fundamental dynamics of the Cold War remained. The missiles were removed from Cuba, but Soviet military power continued to grow. American forces remained in Western Europe, nuclear weapons positioned forward, ready to respond to any Soviet aggression. The arms race continued, both sides developing new weapons systems, multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicles that allowed one missile to carry multiple warheads aimed at different targets, submarine-launched ballistic missiles with ever greater range, bomber fleets maintained on constant alert. The competition had not ended. It had simply been channeled into slightly less reckless forms, the lesson learned not that nuclear weapons were too dangerous to build, but that they were too dangerous to use carelessly, that crises had to be managed more carefully, that brinkmanship had limits that should not be tested too frequently or too far. In Cuba, the aftermath was bitter. Castro felt betrayed by the Soviet decision to remove the missiles without consulting him, without giving him any say in negotiations about his own country's security. He had invited the missiles precisely to deter American invasion, to protect his revolution, and now they were being removed in exchange for a promise he did not entirely trust. A pledge of non-invasion from a government that had already tried to overthrow him at the Bay of Pigs, that had tried to assassinate him multiple times, that maintained an economic embargo designed to strangle his economy. The crisis had been resolved between the superpowers, but Cuba's position remained precarious, still 90 miles from a hostile United States, still dependent on Soviet support that had proven unreliable at the critical moment. Castro withdrew somewhat from the Soviet embrace, maintaining the alliance but with less enthusiasm, exploring ties with other revolutionary movements, becoming a more independent actor even as Cuba remained within the Soviet sphere. The island became a symbol of Cold War tensions frozen in place, the revolution preserved but isolated, the embargo continuing for decades, the standoff unresolved even as the larger Cold War eventually ended. The crisis also revealed the limitations of intelligence and the dangers of certainty in the absence of complete information. American intelligence had estimated that there were no nuclear warheads in Cuba yet, that the missiles were not yet operational, that they had time to act before the threat became acute. Years later, after the Cold War ended, Soviet officers revealed that the warheads were already there, that tactical nuclear weapons were deployed and ready to use, that if the United States had invaded as the Joint Chiefs recommended, Soviet commanders had authority to use nuclear weapons to defend against the invasion, which almost certainly would have triggered American nuclear retaliation and led to exactly the escalation everyone feared. The invasion that nearly happened would not have been a conventional military operation but the beginning of nuclear war, and the decision not to invade had been based partly on faulty intelligence that underestimated how advanced the Soviet deployment actually was. Kennedy had been right for reasons he did not fully know. His caution vindicated not just by the successful resolution, but by the catastrophe his restraint had unknowingly avoided. The world that emerged from October 1962 was in many ways unchanged. The same alliances, the same weapons, the same ideological division, the same fundamental competition between systems and visions of how humanity should organize itself. But something had shifted in the collective consciousness, in the understanding of what the Cold War meant and what it risked. The abstract threat of nuclear war had become concrete. The possibility of annihilation had been made real in ways that could not be dismissed or ignored, and the generation that lived through those 13 days carried that knowledge forward. They had seen how thin the margin was between survival and extinction, how much depended on the judgment of a few individuals, how easily accident could become catastrophe, and they could never again feel entirely safe, never again trust entirely that the system designed to prevent war would function as intended when the pressure became intense enough. Children who were young in October 1962 remembered it differently than adults, remembered the drills and the fear in their parents' faces more than the actual diplomatic maneuvering. But they remembered, and as they grew into adulthood, they carried with them a skepticism about authority, a questioning of the leaders who had brought the world so close to ending, a determination that their generation would not repeat the mistakes of the one that preceded them. The anti-war movements of the 1960s, the nuclear freeze campaign of the 1980s, the peace activism that characterized much of the Cold War's later decades all drew energy from the memory of October 1962, from the knowledge that the unthinkable had nearly happened, that only luck and last-minute rationality had prevented it, and that trusting to luck again would be folly. For Kennedy and Khrushchev, the crisis was both triumph and trauma, the greatest test of their leadership and the source of their deepest fears. Kennedy, speaking at American University in June 1963, delivered what many considered his finest speech, calling for a re-examination of attitudes toward the Soviet Union, acknowledging common interests in survival and peace, urging Americans to see Soviet citizens not as enemies to be destroyed, but as human beings who shared the same planet and the same desire to live and raise their children in safety. It was a remarkable speech for a Cold War president, idealistic yet grounded in the hard lessons of October 1962, and it represented a vision of what the relationship between superpowers could become if fear could be tempered with wisdom. He did not live to see whether that vision could be realized 5 months later. He was assassinated in Dallas, his promise unfulfilled, his evolution from Cold Warrior to peacemaker cut short, leaving only the speech as testament to what might have been possible. Khrushchev survived the crisis politically but was weakened by it, criticized by hardliners who saw his backing down as humiliation, who argued that the Soviet Union had appeared weak, had lost prestige, had allowed the Americans to dictate terms. 2 years later, in 1964, he was removed from power in a coup by his own party, replaced by leaders less inclined to risk dramatic gestures, more cautious, more bureaucratic, less willing to gamble on personal diplomacy. He spent his final years in retirement writing memoirs that were smuggled out of the Soviet Union and published in the West, reflecting on his time in power, defending his decisions during the Missile Crisis. arguing that he had saved the world even if the world did not recognize it, even if his own country saw it as defeat rather than wisdom. He died in 1971, forgotten by official Soviet history. His funeral barely noted, his role in the crisis not fully acknowledged until after the Soviet Union itself had collapsed and archives began to open. The Cuban Missile Crisis became the defining moment of the Cold War, the point when the abstract became concrete, when the dance along the edge of catastrophe came closest to becoming the catastrophe itself. And though the world survived, though the crisis was resolved and life continued, those 13 days in October cast a shadow that never fully lifted, a reminder that the weapons existed, that the threat remained, that the next crisis might not be resolved so fortunately, and that humanity was living on borrowed time, hoping that wisdom and luck would continue to hold, knowing that eventually one or both might fail, and that when they did, there would be no second chances, no opportunities to learn from mistakes, only silence and ash, and the end of the long, strange experiment of human civilization. Chapter 5. The Long Twilight and the Quiet Ending. The decades that followed the Cuban Missile Crisis were neither peace nor war, but something in between, a long twilight where the superpowers circled each other with caution born of near catastrophe, testing limits without crossing them, competing without confronting, waging the Cold War through proxies and surrogates while avoiding direct engagement that might spiral into the nuclear exchange both had learned to fear. The world adjusted to living under the shadow, normalized the abnormal, and found ways to carry on even as the arsenals grew larger, the competition more sophisticated, the ideological divide more entrenched. It was a strange kind of stability, this balance of terror, this mutual understanding that neither side could win, but both could lose. And in that understanding lay a grim foundation for coexistence, not friendship or trust, but acknowledgement that survival required restraint, that the alternative to restraint was unthinkable, and therefore must not be thought, must not be allowed, must be prevented by whatever means necessary short of the very weapons that made prevention necessary in the first place. Vietnam became the defining conflict of this period, a war that America entered incrementally, advisors becoming soldiers, thousands becoming hundreds of thousands, a commitment that deepened year by year until it consumed a generation and shattered the consensus that had sustained American foreign policy since World War II. It began as anti-communism, as containment, as the belief that if South Vietnam fell to the communist North, all of Southeast Asia would follow like dominoes, one nation after another toppling until the entire region was lost. But what began as strategy became quagmire, a war in jungles and rice paddies against an enemy that would not fight conventional battles, that melted into villages and reappeared at night, that absorbed casualties that would have broken any Western army and simply continued fighting, supplied by the Soviets and Chinese, motivated by nationalism as much as ideology, determined to reunify their country regardless of cost. American forces won every major engagement, killed enemies in numbers that should have meant victory, deployed technologies that gave them overwhelming advantages in firepower and mobility, yet somehow never achieved the decisive triumph that would end the war and justify the sacrifice. The bombing campaigns were relentless. Millions of tons of explosives dropped on North Vietnam, more than were used in all of World War II, targeting infrastructure and supply lines and anything that might contribute to the enemy's capacity to wage war. The jungle was sprayed with Agent Orange, chemical defoliants that stripped the leaves from trees, that removed cover and concealment, that also poisoned the soil and the water and the people who lived there, causing cancers and birth defects that would persist for generations. The ecological warfare justified by military necessity, but causing harm far beyond the battlefield, far beyond the war's duration. Villages suspected of harboring Viet Cong were burned, their populations relocated to strategic hamlets, concentration camps in all but name, where peasants were separated from their land and their livelihoods in the hope of denying the enemy support. But the policy created more enemies than it eliminated, more resentment than cooperation, turning neutrals into combatants, pushing the uncommitted into the arms of the communists, who at least were fighting for Vietnamese sovereignty rather than foreign occupation. At home, the war divided America more deeply than anything since the Civil War. Young men were drafted, sent to fight in a conflict many did not understand, for objectives that seemed to shift with each passing year, and as the casualties mounted, as the television news showed body bags and burning villages and soldiers, whose 1,000-yard stares testified to horrors beyond description, more and more Americans began to question whether this war was just, whether it was winnable, whether it was worth the cost. The protests started small, on college campuses, among students who faced the draft and saw no reason to die in a jungle on the other side of the world for a government that existed mainly on paper and in American imagination. But the movement grew, spreading beyond campuses to include clergy and veterans and ordinary citizens who simply could not reconcile the America they believed in with the America that was napalming villages and tallying body counts as though human lives were statistics, as though victory could be measured in the number of enemies killed rather than in any political objective achieved. The images that came back from Vietnam were unlike anything previous wars had produced. Uncensored, immediate, brought into living rooms every evening by television news that showed the war as it actually was rather than as government spokesmen described it. Americans saw monks immolating themselves in protest, saw a South Vietnamese general executing a prisoner in the street with a pistol shot to the head, saw children running naked down roads, their skin burned by napalm, screaming in pain and terror, and these images could not be explained away, could not be reconciled with the rhetoric about fighting for freedom and democracy. The credibility gap widened, the distance between official statements and observable reality growing so large that trust in government eroded, cynicism replaced idealism, and the question, "What are we fighting for?" received no satisfactory answer from those prosecuting the war. They spoke of commitments and alliances and dominoes, but the abstractions rang hollow against the concrete images of suffering and destruction that appeared nightly on television screens, against the concrete reality of young men coming home in caskets or coming home damaged, traumatized, addicted, unable to speak of what they had seen and done. They spoke of commitments and alliances and dominoes, but the abstractions rang hollow against the concrete images of suffering and destruction that appeared nightly on television screens, against the concrete reality of young men coming home in caskets or coming home damaged, traumatized, addicted, unable to speak of what they had seen and done. The Soviet Union watched Vietnam with satisfaction, seeing it as proof that the American model was failing, that capitalism's contradictions were being exposed, that the anti-war movement represented the beginning of revolutionary consciousness in the imperial heartland. They supplied North Vietnam with weapons and advisors, helped train forces, provided the surface-to-air missiles that shot down American aircraft, making the war more costly, more difficult, bleeding America without directly engaging American forces, without risking the confrontation that might trigger nuclear escalation. It was proxy war conducted skillfully, the Soviets achieving strategic gains at minimal risk, undermining American credibility and morale, demonstrating to the developing world that the United States could be resisted, that its power was not unlimited, that even the mightiest array in human history could be fought to a stalemate by determined guerrillas with foreign support and popular will. But even as the Soviet Union scored points in Vietnam, it faced its own quagmire building slowly in Afghanistan. In 1979, Soviet forces invaded, moving to prop up a communist government that was losing control to Islamic insurgents, expecting a quick intervention that would stabilize the situation and allow withdrawal within months. Instead, they found themselves fighting a war eerily similar to America's experience in Vietnam, an enemy that would not mass for conventional battle, that struck from ambush and faded into mountains, that had the support of much of the population and refuge in neighboring Pakistan, that was supplied by America and Saudi Arabia and other nations happy to see the Soviets bled the way America had been bled in Southeast Asia. Soviet soldiers, mostly conscripts, found themselves in a war they did not understand, fighting people whose language they did not speak, for objectives that remained unclear even to their commanders. The Mujahideen, fierce and motivated by both nationalism and religious fervor, inflicted steady casualties, shooting down helicopters with American-supplied Stinger missiles, ambushing convoys, making every valley and village potentially lethal. The war in Afghanistan dragged on for nearly a decade, consuming Soviet resources and morale, producing its own generation of traumatized veterans, its own coffins arriving in Russian cities wrapped in secrecy because the government did not want to acknowledge the scale of losses, its own mothers demanding to know why their sons were dying in a country that posed no threat to the Soviet Union. The parallels to Vietnam were obvious to everyone except perhaps the Soviet leadership, who had watched America's failure and somehow convinced themselves that their ideology, their military, their determination would produce different results. But mountains and faith and guerrilla warfare care nothing for ideology, and the same tactics that defeated American power in Vietnam defeated Soviet power in Afghanistan. The same dynamics of foreign occupation generating resistance, the same disconnect between military victories and political objectives creating stalemate, the same gradual erosion of will that eventually makes continuation impossible regardless of what has already been invested. Between these two wars, between Vietnam and Afghanistan, the superpowers found moments of détente, periods when the competition softened, when dialogue replaced confrontation, when it seemed possible that the Cold War might slowly exhaust itself into something more manageable. In 1972, President Richard Nixon traveled to Moscow and signed the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, SALT-I, which placed caps on the number of ballistic missiles each side could deploy, the first agreement that actually limited rather than simply slowed the growth of nuclear arsenals. It was limited in scope, full of loopholes, permitted modernization even as it constrained numbers, but it represented progress, acknowledgement that the arms race had become absurd, that building the 10,000th warhead added nothing to security that the 9,000th had not already provided, that resources spent on weapons were resources not spent on everything else societies needed: schools, hospitals, infrastructure, research, the things that actually improved lives rather than simply threatening to end them. Nixon's visit to Moscow was preceded by his historic opening to China, The recognition that the communist world was not monolithic, that the Sino-Soviet split had created opportunities for triangular diplomacy, for playing one communist power against the other, for reducing the sense of encirclement that drove Soviet paranoia. The photographs of Nixon toasting with Mao Zedong, of American and Chinese leaders meeting after decades of mutual hostility, shocked both nations and the world, but they also created new dynamics, new calculations, new possibilities for alignment and realignment that made the Cold War less binary, less a simple matter of East versus West, capitalism versus communism. The Chinese welcomed American engagement because they feared the Soviet Union more than they feared the United States, because their border clashes with Soviet forces in the late 1960s had shown them that ideological brotherhood meant nothing when territorial interests conflicted, and because isolation had served them poorly, had left them economically stagnant and diplomatically marginalized. Détente reached its high point with the Helsinki Accords in 1975, where 35 nations, including both superpowers and most of Europe, signed agreements recognizing existing borders, promising cooperation on economic and environmental issues, and, crucially, committing to respect human rights and fundamental freedoms. The Soviet side, believing the human rights provisions were symbolic, unenforceable, a small price to pay for Western recognition of Soviet control over Eastern Europe, for legitimization of the territorial gains made in World War II and maintained ever since. But they miscalculated. The human rights provisions gave dissidents in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe a framework for resistance, a set of principles their governments had publicly committed to, and activists began holding their governments accountable, demanding that the Helsinki commitments be honored, forming organizations to monitor compliance, publicizing abuses, and finding support in the West among governments and citizens who used Helsinki as leverage, as justification for pressuring the Soviet bloc to reform. The dissident movement in the Soviet Union grew slowly but persistently. Intellectuals and activists willing to risk imprisonment and exile to speak truths that official ideology denied, to document the gap between socialist promises and Soviet realities, to demand the freedoms that Helsinki had supposedly guaranteed. Andrei Sakharov, the physicist who had designed the Soviet hydrogen bomb, became the movement's most prominent voice, using his prestige to criticize Soviet militarism, nuclear testing, human rights abuses, and the Afghan war. He was harassed, stripped of his honors, eventually exiled to the closed city of Gorky, where he could not communicate with Western press. But his moral authority remained. His example inspired others, and the government's treatment of him became another source of international criticism, another indication that the Soviet system could not tolerate dissent, could not accommodate the very freedoms it had committed to in Helsinki. In Poland, workers formed Solidarity, an independent trade union that became a mass movement, millions strong, demanding not just better wages and conditions, but political freedom, democratic reforms, the right to organize and speak without state control. For a time in 1980 and 1981, it seemed Poland might break free, might negotiate a new relationship between state and society, might demonstrate that reform was possible within the Soviet system. But the Soviet Union would not tolerate such experiments in its sphere of influence, and in December 1981, under Soviet pressure, the Polish government imposed martial law, arrested Solidarity leaders, banned the union, crushed the movement with tanks and arrests, and the suspension of all civil liberties. The crackdown succeeded in the short term, restoring control, silencing opposition, but it failed in the long term because it demonstrated that Soviet-style socialism could survive only through force, that given the choice, people would reject it, that the system's legitimacy rested not on popular support but on military power and the threat of Soviet intervention. And such foundations were inherently unstable, sustainable only so long as the will and capacity to use force remained. The arms race continued through these years, despite détente, despite treaties, because neither side could afford to fall behind, because verification was difficult and trust non-existent, because military establishments on both sides had enormous institutional momentum, budgets that demanded spending, contractors that depended on weapons production, strategic doctrines that required constant modernization. New weapon systems emerged: cruise missiles that could fly under radar, mobile missile launchers that could not be targeted by first strikes, neutron bombs designed to kill people while leaving infrastructure intact, as though such distinctions mattered in nuclear war, as though there were gradations of apocalypse worth planning for. The vocabulary of nuclear strategy grew increasingly abstract, discussing throw weight and circular error probability and counterforce versus countervalue targeting, the language serving to distance planners from the human reality of what these weapons would do, from the fact that every discussion of megatonnage and delivery systems and acceptable casualties was ultimately a discussion of burning cities and dying children and the end of civilization. Ronald Reagan entered the presidency in 1981, speaking the language of Cold War confrontation with a clarity and conviction that had been absent during the détente years. He called the Soviet Union an evil empire, refused to accept permanent division as inevitable, increased military spending dramatically, and proposed the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, a space-based missile defense system that would supposedly render nuclear weapons obsolete by intercepting them in flight. Critics called it Star Wars, dismissed it as technically impossible, economically wasteful, strategically destabilizing, but Reagan believed in it, or at least saw its value as leverage, as a program the Soviets could not match, that would force them to spend resources they did not have, that would make clear the economic disparities between systems, the fact that American capitalism, for all its flaws, produced wealth and technology in ways Soviet central planning could not match. The Soviet leadership watched Reagan with alarm, his rhetoric aggressive, his military buildup threatening, his refusal to accept the status quo suggesting he might be willing to risk war to change it. In November 1983, NATO conducted military exercises, Able Archer 83, simulating the procedures for nuclear release, and Soviet intelligence, already paranoid, interpreted the exercises as possible cover for an actual first strike, as the beginning of an attack disguised as an exercise until it was too late to respond. Soviet nuclear forces went on heightened alert, ready to launch if indicators suggested the attack was real, and for several days, the world was closer to accidental nuclear war than anyone realized, the crisis invisible to the public, unfolding in intelligence assessments and readiness levels, averted only when the exercises ended, and Soviet analysts concluded that no attack was coming. The incident demonstrated how fragile stability remained, how easily misunderstanding could create catastrophe, how the systems designed to provide warning and response time could themselves become sources of instability, compressing decision-making into minutes, creating hair-trigger situations where accident or miscalculation could start wars no one intended. But even as tensions peaked in the early 1980s, forces were building beneath the surface that would transform everything, not through war or negotiation, but through the simple exhaustion of a system that could no longer sustain itself. The Soviet economy, never robust, was collapsing under the weight of military spending, technological stagnation, and an ideology that stifled innovation and individual initiative. Central planning worked barely for producing steel and coal and basic industrial goods, but it could not adapt to the information age, could not compete with Western economies that were transitioning from manufacturing to services and technology, could not match the dynamism of markets that allocated resources through millions of individual decisions rather than through bureaucratic 5-year plans. The Afghan war was bleeding resources and morale, producing nothing but casualties and resentment. The population, long resigned to shortages and restrictions, was becoming aware through Western radio broadcasts and samizdat literature that the gap between their living standards and those in the West was widening, that the promises of communism remained unfulfilled while capitalism, for all its inequalities, was delivering prosperity to its citizens. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became General Secretary of the Communist Party, the youngest man to lead the Soviet Union in decades, and he understood that without fundamental reform, the system would collapse. He introduced glasnost, openness, allowing previously forbidden discussions of Soviet history and current problems, permitting criticism that had been suppressed for decades. He introduced perestroika, restructuring, attempting to reform the economy by allowing limited private enterprise, giving factory managers more autonomy, reducing central planning's grip on every aspect of production. The reforms were intended to save communism by making it more flexible, more responsive, more capable of meeting people's needs, but they had the opposite effect. Glasnost revealed how badly the system had failed, how extensive the corruption was, how many lies had been told about everything from economic performance to environmental disasters like Chernobyl. Perestroika created chaos without prosperity, disrupting existing systems without creating functional alternatives, producing shortages worse than before as the old structures broke down and new ones failed to emerge. Gorbachev also changed Soviet foreign policy, recognizing that the military competition was bankrupting the country, that maintaining the empire in Eastern Europe and client states worldwide was costing more than it was worth, that reducing tensions and cutting military spending were necessary for domestic reform to have any chance of success. He met with Reagan at Reykjavik in 1986, and though the summit failed to achieve the dramatic arms reductions both initially discussed, it marked a turning point, the beginning of a relationship that evolved from hostility to wary respect to something approaching partnership. Reagan, initially skeptical, came to believe that Gorbachev was different, that he genuinely wanted to end the Cold War, that deals made with him might actually be honored. In 1987, they signed the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, INF, which eliminated an entire class of nuclear missiles, the first time nuclear weapons were actually destroyed rather than simply limited. The images of missiles being dismantled, of verification inspections where American observers watched Soviet weapons being cut apart and Soviet observers watched American weapons destroyed, represented something new, tangible proof that the arsenals could be reduced, that the Cold War's assumptions could be questioned and changed. Gorbachev also announced that the Soviet Union would no longer intervene to maintain communist governments in Eastern Europe, that the Brezhnev Doctrine, which had justified invasions of Hungary and Czechoslovakia, was dead, that each nation was free to choose its own path. The statement seemed almost casual, buried in a speech, easy to miss, but it changed everything. The communist governments of Eastern Europe existed only because Soviet tanks kept them in power, only because everyone knew that reform attempts would be crushed as they had been in 1956 and 1968. Remove the threat of Soviet intervention, and the entire structure became vulnerable, dependent on governments that had no popular legitimacy, no ability to govern except through coercion. And coercion worked only when backed by the ultimate threat of Soviet force. Once that threat was removed, once people realized the Soviets would not intervene, the communist regimes were exposed as hollow, propped up by nothing but habit and fear, and both were evaporating rapidly. Poland moved first. Solidarity, which had survived underground during martial law, negotiated with the government in 1989, winning the right to contest elections, and when the elections were held in June, Solidarity won overwhelmingly, a landslide that produced the first non-communist government in Eastern Europe since the 1940s. The Soviets did nothing. Hungary began dismantling its border fence with Austria, creating a hole in the Iron Curtain, and East Germans began fleeing west through Hungary by the thousands, entire families abandoning everything for the chance to escape. The Soviets did nothing. In Leipzig and Dresden and cities across East Germany, protests grew week by week, hundreds becoming thousands, becoming hundreds of thousands, people marching with candles, chanting, "Wir sind das Volk." We are the people, demanding change, demanding freedom, demanding that the government step aside and let them determine their own future. The security forces watched, but did not fire, paralyzed by uncertainty, waiting for orders from Moscow that never came, unsure whether they were supposed to crush the protests or allow them. And in that uncertainty, the regime simply dissolved, authority draining away like water through cupped hands. On November 9, 1989, a confused East German official announced at a press conference that travel restrictions were being lifted, effective immediately. It was a mistake, a misunderstanding of what had actually been decided, but once the words were spoken, they could not be taken back. East Berliners heard the announcement and converged on the border crossings, thousands at first, then tens of thousands, demanding to pass. And the guards, overwhelmed and lacking clear orders, opened the gates. People poured through, crying, laughing, disbelieving, into West Berlin, where crowds waited to greet them with champagne and flowers and embraces. They climbed on top of the Berlin Wall, that symbol of division that had stood for 28 years, and they danced on it, spray-painted it, began chipping pieces from it with hammers and chisels, tearing it down with their bare hands, transforming it from instrument of oppression to souvenir in a single night. Television cameras caught it all, broadcast it worldwide. The images impossible to misinterpret. The Cold War's most visible symbol was falling, and no one was trying to stop it, and the joy on people's faces testified to decades of suffering finally ending, to freedom delayed but not defeated, to the human spirit's refusal to accept permanent captivity. The rest of Eastern Europe followed quickly, a cascade of liberation that seemed almost too easy, too fast, decades of communist control evaporating in weeks. Czechoslovakia's Velvet Revolution brought down the government peacefully, playwright Václav Havel moving from prison to presidency in a matter of months. Bulgaria's communist leadership resigned. Romania's was more violent, Ceausescu refusing to step down, his security forces firing on protesters until the army switched sides, and the dictator and his wife were captured, tried, and executed on Christmas Day 1989, their bodies shown on television as proof that the nightmare was finally over. Only in Albania and Yugoslavia did communism cling to power, and Yugoslavia would soon tear itself apart in ethnic conflicts that had been suppressed but not resolved by communist rule. the state fracturing into wars that would consume the Balkans through the 1990s, demonstrating that the end of the Cold War did not mean the end of conflict, only the end of one particular framework for understanding and managing it. The Soviet Union watched its empire collapse with a mixture of resignation and relief. The hardliners wanted intervention, wanted tanks sent to restore order, but Gorbachev refused, understanding that force would accomplish nothing except to delay the inevitable while destroying any remaining credibility the Soviet system retained. The cost of empire had become unbearable, and letting it go was not defeat but necessity, freeing resources for domestic reform, removing burdens that could no longer be sustained. But losing the empire destabilized the Soviet Union itself, because if Poland and Hungary and East Germany could leave, why not Ukraine? Why not the Baltic states? Why not any of the republics that had been incorporated into the USSR against their will, that had been promised autonomy but received only Moscow's control? The logic that freed Eastern Europe applied equally within Soviet borders, and once that logic was accepted, the Soviet Union's days were numbered. In August 1991, hardliners attempted a coup, placing Gorbachev under house arrest at his vacation home, announcing that they were taking control to restore order and discipline, to save socialism from the chaos of reform. But the coup failed, not because it was opposed by force, but because it was opposed by people standing in the streets, refusing to accept the return of authoritarianism, protecting the Russian parliament building, facing down tanks with nothing but courage and conviction. Boris Yeltsin, president of the Russian Republic, stood on a tank and rallied resistance, becoming the symbol of democratic opposition, and the coup plotters, realizing they had no support, no legitimacy, no ability to govern even if they took power, gave up after 3 days, and the Soviet system's last gasp ended not with violence, but with pathetic collapse, with leaders who could not lead, with an apparatus that could not function, with a coup that surrendered to unarmed citizens. The Soviet Union officially dissolved on December 25, 1991. Gorbachev resigning as president of a country that no longer existed. The red flag with hammer and sickle lowered from the Kremlin and replaced with the Russian tricolor. There was no ceremony, no grand pronouncement, just paperwork and bureaucracy, the end of an empire that had lasted 7 decades processed through legal formalities and administrative procedures. The 15 Soviet republics became 15 independent nations, some eagerly embracing independence, others uncertain what it meant, all facing the challenge of building new systems, new economies, new identities after decades of Moscow's control. Russia inherited the Soviet Union's nuclear weapons and its seat on the UN Security Council, but it also inherited economic collapse, political instability, a population traumatized by rapid change and uncertain about the future. The victory of capitalism over communism that Western leaders celebrated looked more ambiguous to Russians living through hyperinflation and the looting of state assets by oligarchs who watched their savings evaporate and their security disappear, who wondered if what they had gained in freedom was worth what they had lost in stability. The Cold War ended not with the dramatic confrontation that had been feared for decades, not with the nuclear exchange that had haunted nightmares and shaped policy, but with a bureaucrat's signature on a resignation letter, with a flag being lowered, with the quiet acknowledgement that an era had passed. The silence of it was almost anticlimactic, as though history itself was unsure how to process the end of something so vast, so defining, so woven into the fabric of the second half of the 20th century, that its absence left a void no one quite knew how to fill. There were celebrations, certainly, in Berlin and Prague and Warsaw, in the capitals of newly free nations. People danced in the streets and toasted their liberation. But there was also confusion, uncertainty, the recognition that the structures that had organized the world for 45 years were gone, and what would replace them remained unclear, unwritten, a future suddenly open in ways both exhilarating and terrifying. The nuclear arsenals remained, thousands of warheads still pointed at cities, still ready to launch, even though the ideological justification for their existence had evaporated. The START treaties that followed in the 1990s reduced the numbers significantly, both sides cutting their stockpiles, dismantling weapons that had cost fortunes to build and that now cost fortunes to safely dismantle, the radioactive materials requiring careful handling, the warheads requiring secure storage or destruction, the entire process expensive and complex and never quite complete. Even today, decades after the Cold War ended, thousands of nuclear weapons remain operational, a legacy of an era that could not quite bring itself to fully disarm, that maintained the weapons as insurance against an uncertain future, as symbols of power even when their utility had become questionable, as artifacts of a time when their existence seemed necessary, but that now seem more like curses than blessings, burdens that cannot be easily shed. For those who had lived through the Cold War, who had grown up under the shadow and who watched it finally lift, the end brought a complex mixture of emotions. Relief, certainly, that the threat of nuclear annihilation had receded, that children would not grow up practicing duck and cover drills, that the anxiety that had been baseline for so long could finally ease. But also a strange emptiness, because the Cold War had provided structure, had organized politics and culture and identity around clear oppositions, and its absence left questions about what came next, what the world stood for if not freedom versus tyranny, what struggles mattered if not the great ideological contest that had consumed 2 generations. Some spoke of the end of history, the idea that liberal democracy and market capitalism had triumphed definitively, that no alternative system remained viable, that the future would be one of gradual global convergence around Western models. But history, of course, did not end. New conflicts emerged, some rooted in ethnic and religious identities that the Cold War had suppressed, others rooted in economic inequalities and resource competition, and the hope that the Cold War's end would usher in an era of peace proved as naive as earlier hopes that World War I had been the war to end all wars. The generation that came of age after the Cold War ended grew up in a different world, one where the threat of global nuclear war seemed remote, almost unimaginable, a relic of their parents' and grandparents' time. They did not practice air raid drills, did not watch civil defense films, did not carry the ambient anxiety that had characterized Cold War childhood. But they faced different threats, terrorism that struck without warning, climate change that threatened slowly but comprehensively, economic instability that could destroy livelihoods without firing a shot, pandemics that demonstrated how interconnected and vulnerable modern civilization had become. The Cold War had been terrifying, but it had also been strangely simple, a binary struggle where sides were clear and strategies straightforward, where the enemy wore uniforms and spoke different languages and could be identified, targeted, deterred. The post-Cold War world was more complex, threats more diffuse, enemies harder to define, solutions less obvious, and in some ways, the clarity of the Cold War was almost missed. The nostalgia for a time when things made sense, even if they were dangerous. The intelligence services that had fought the invisible war found themselves repurposed but not disbanded, their budgets maintained, their networks intact, their methods adapted to new targets. The apparatus built to spy on the Soviet Union turned its attention to terrorism, to nuclear proliferation, to cyber threats, to whatever new dangers could justify continued funding and secrecy. Some of the old Cold Warriors adapted successfully, bringing their skills and experience to bear on new problems, but others struggled, trained for a conflict that no longer existed, mourning a world where their expertise had mattered, where the stakes had been clear and their role essential. The culture of secrecy persisted, the habits of classification and compartmentalization, the tendency to operate without oversight. And critics argued that the security state built for the Cold War had outlived its original purpose, but had become too powerful, too entrenched to be reformed or constrained, that the temporary measures enacted for the emergency had become permanent features of governance, and that freedom had been sacrificed in ways that would not be easily recovered, even though the threat that justified the sacrifice had ended. Russia's relationship with the West after the Cold War was complicated, marked by expectations on both sides that were never quite fulfilled. The West hoped that Russia would embrace democracy and capitalism smoothly, that it would integrate into the international order as a partner rather than an adversary, that the end of communism meant the beginning of friendship. But the economic shock therapy of the 1990s devastated Russia's economy. Enriched oligarchs who looted state assets impoverished millions of ordinary Russians and created resentments that would simmer for decades. NATO's expansion eastward, incorporating former Warsaw Pact nations and even former Soviet republics, was seen by many Russians not as those nations' free choice, but as Western encroachment, as betrayal of promises allegedly made during German reunification, as the victor taking advantage of the defeated. Vladimir Putin, who rose to power at the end of the 1990s, promised to restore Russian pride and strength, and his increasingly authoritarian rule and aggressive foreign policy reflected both his personal worldview and genuine popular sentiment that Russia had been humiliated, that the West had not treated it as an equal partner, that strength was the only language international politics understood. The developing world, which had been the chessboard for superpower competition, found itself suddenly less important to great powers more focused on other priorities. The proxy wars ended, sometimes with negotiated settlements, sometimes with one side simply collapsing when external support dried up. But the damage remained: millions dead, societies traumatized, economies destroyed, institutions corrupted, weapons flooded into regions where they would fuel conflicts for decades. Afghanistan, abandoned by both superpowers after the Soviet withdrawal, descended into civil war and eventually became the base for Al-Qaeda, the terrorist organization that would attack the United States on September 11, 2001, demonstrating that the consequences of Cold War policies outlasted the Cold War itself, that the weapons provided and the extremism encouraged for short-term strategic advantage could not be simply turned off when they were no longer needed. That actions had consequences that rippled forward unpredictably, creating problems that future generations would have to address. The environmental legacy of the Cold War was immense and will persist for centuries. The nuclear test sites remain contaminated. The islands where bombs were detonated poisoned, the communities downwind still experiencing elevated cancer rates and genetic damage. The production facilities that manufactured nuclear weapons left behind vast quantities of radioactive waste, some stored safely, some leaked into groundwater, all requiring management for time spans that dwarf human institutions, that raise questions about how to mark these sites so that future civilizations, should they exist, will know to avoid them. The Cold War's environmental damage was not limited to radiation, military bases, contaminated land with chemicals and fuels, weapons testing ranges left behind unexploded ordnance, the resource extraction that fed the arms race scarred landscapes and polluted rivers. The cleanup costs are astronomical, the work will take generations, and some damage is essentially permanent, irreversible on any human timescale. The price paid for a competition that ended without the war it was supposed to prepare for, that left behind toxic legacies even though the bombs were never used. Looking back now, decades after the Cold War ended, the entire era seems almost incomprehensible, a collective madness that humanity somehow survived. Two nations built enough weapons to destroy the world multiple times over, aimed them at each other, developed elaborate strategies for using them, and maintained this posture for 45 years, all while conducting normal life, raising children, building cities, creating art, as though the sword of Damocles hanging over everything was just another fact of existence, no more remarkable than weather or seasons. The generation that lived through it adapted because humans adapt, because the alternative to adaptation was despair, because life demands to be lived even when the conditions for life are irrational and dangerous. They built fallout shelters and had families. They protested nuclear weapons and went to work the next morning. They feared annihilation and planned for retirement, holding contradictions that should have been unbearable, but that became, somehow, normal. The Cold War haunted the world, not just during its duration, but long after its end, in the weapons that remain, in the institutions it created, in the habits of thought it instilled, in the memories carried by those who lived through it. It shaped international relations, establishing precedents and patterns that persist, the expectation that great powers will compete, that alliances must be maintained against potential adversaries, that military strength underwrites diplomatic influence, that threats must be met with threats and power balanced with power. It shaped domestic politics, normalizing surveillance and secrecy, creating security establishments that operate beyond public scrutiny, establishing emergency powers that become permanent, training citizens to accept restrictions on freedom as the price of security. It shaped culture, producing art and literature and film that grappled with absurdity and apocalypse, that questioned authority and certainty, that reflected the anxiety of living under constant threat. And perhaps most profoundly, the Cold War demonstrated both humanity's capacity for restraint and its proximity to self-destruction. For 45 years, the weapons existed and were not used, deterrents held, crises were managed, the brink was approached but never crossed. That is remarkable, an achievement worth acknowledging, proof that even in the most dangerous circumstances, wisdom can prevail, that leaders can choose restraint over aggression, that survival can be valued more than victory. But the Cold War also showed how close we came, how many times accident or miscalculation or individual decision nearly triggered catastrophe, how much depended on luck and the judgment of people whose names most will never know, how thin the margin was between civilization and annihilation. We survived, but not because the system was safe or stable or rational. We survived despite the system, because enough people at enough critical moments made the right choice, because enough fail-safes functioned, because we were lucky, and luck is not a strategy that can be relied upon forever. The Cold War ended, but its echoes remain. In the nuclear arsenals that still exist, smaller but still capable of ending civilization. in the geopolitical competition between great powers that never truly ceased, that merely changed form and focus, in the generation that grew up under the shadow and learned to accept anxiety as normal, to distrust authority that claimed to act in their interest, to question narratives that justified sacrifice for distant objectives, in the institutions built to fight it that found new purposes but kept their old powers, in the memory of what humanity created and somehow barely survived, a war that never turned hot, a competition that produced no victor, only exhausted participants, a long twilight that finally gave way not to the dawn of peace, but to a different kind of darkness, less total, perhaps, but no less uncertain. A world still haunted by the choices made in those decades when the Cold War held the world in its frozen grip and taught us that we are capable of building our own extinction and, just possibly, capable of choosing not to activate it. As the night deepens and these words fade into silence, as you drift toward sleep, let this be the lesson carried forward, that humanity faced its darkest test not in the violence that erupted but in the 10 to the 10. Violence that was restrained, not in the war that was fought, but in the war that was avoided. Not in the weapons that were used, but in the weapons that remained, thankfully, blessedly, in their silos and submarines, never launched, never detonated, never fulfilling their terrible purpose. The Cold War haunted the world for generations, and in its haunting, perhaps, taught us something essential about ourselves, about our capacity for both creation and destruction, about the choice that exists always between them, and about the necessity of choosing wisely, because the next time we might not be so fortunate. Sleep now, knowing that this particular nightmare ended not with fire, but with flags being lowered, with walls coming down, with people dancing in streets where they had been forbidden to walk freely, with the quiet recognition that even the longest night eventually gives way to morning, even if the morning brings new challenges, new uncertainties, new struggles. The Cold War is over, its ghosts remain, and we are still here, still learning what it meant, still living with its legacy, still hoping that its lessons were learned deeply enough to prevent their terrible repetition. Rest well. Tomorrow continues the story we are still writing.